And now, a word from the president.
Damn, it feels good to be a gangster.
I would love to have, I would say, Governor Moore call, because I watched him over the weekend trying to explain that Baltimore, what they need is housing. No, they don't need housing. They need to get rid of the criminals. These are hardcore criminals.
This is the big story at 5 o'clock that we continue to follow. President Trump once again taking shots at Baltimore, saying he will soon step in.
The president says he's going to send the National Guard to our city. Welcome to the news at 5. I'm Nikki Zizaza.
And I'm Rick Ritter. Now, the big question is, when will this happen? The president did not say anything about timing, but he also said federal troops are heading to Chicago.
WJZ is live. Tara Lynch joins us with reaction. Tara.
Yeah, Nikki and Rick, good evening. We are hearing that announcement just made this afternoon. Of course, the president saying this is an effort to fight crime. But as we've reported many times, state and local leaders here in Maryland are firmly against any troop deployment in the state and here in Baltimore City. The president's announcement came during a news conference this afternoon saying he would deploy troops in cities like Baltimore and Chicago. He did not say when the National Guard would deploy in either city. The president cited a U.S. News and World Report ranking which slates Baltimore as the 4th worst in the nation in crime and murders, despite the city seeing a strong and historic decrease in homicides and violent crime this year. According to the latest data from Baltimore police, Baltimore City has seen a nearly 30% drop in homicides this year. The president's announcement comes after the Governor Moore invited the president on a public safety walk in Baltimore in September.
If the governor of Illinois would call me up, I would love to do it. Now, we're going to do it anyway. We have the right to do it because I have an obligation to protect this country. And that includes Baltimore.
We're still waiting to hear back from Mayor Brandon Scott and Governor Wes Moore. I've spoken to many neighbors in recent weeks about this, and many of them tell me that they do not think the National Guard needs to deploy here in Baltimore City. We'll have much more on this coming up later this evening, but for now, live in the Inner Harbor, Tara Lynch, WJZ.
This city, these people, making the rest of us feel like we don't belong. But they're no better than us. Look at how they treat their children. Mark my words, Mr. Resendez. If it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse one.
New today in federal court, several of those who suffered child sexual abuse at the hands of priests are sharing their stories of survival. It's one of 3 victim impact hearings amid the Archdiocese of Baltimore's ongoing bankruptcy proceedings. Fox 45's Rebecca Pryor joins us now with their message for the church and the next steps in the case. Rebecca?
Kai, after decades of being silenced, today nearly a dozen survivors making their voices heard in front of the court and church leadership. Emotions ran high, many moved to tears, and even some shouting at church officials.
What you're going to hear today are testimony from survivors who were abused, who were raped, who were emotionally and physically damaged, and who've lost parts of their lives. And the Catholic Church does not want you to hear that.
Outside of Baltimore's federal courthouse, survivors of child sex abuse gathering for an hours-long hearing. A bankruptcy judge providing them a rare opportunity to share in their own words how the abuse they suffered at the hands of Catholic priests years ago still impacts them today.
They want people to think it's all about money. But here today, we're going to hear that it's not all about money.
With their ongoing struggles spanning from addiction, suicidal ideologies, and a lack of self-esteem.
It's life-changing. A lot of them have been carrying this around for 20, 30, 40 years.
Paul Jan Zunick, chairman of the committee representing the survivors, arguing the church has not acted in good faith throughout the years-long bankruptcy battle.
It's been difficult. It feels like you're being abused all over again.
Recently, the Archdiocese offering a $33 million settlement, adding insurance companies will likely contribute hundreds of millions on top of that. Money that would be spread out between nearly 1,000 victims.
Which gives, the survivors, $1.85. I mean, it's just a joke of what their offer was.
Rob Jenner, an attorney for several survivors, saying for his clients, the payout isn't about a dollar amount. It's about restoring dignity.
These people have been hurt, and by giving a nominal amount, it's saying this was not such a big deal, or get over it.
You know niggas die for equal pay, right? You know when I work, I ain't your slave, right? You know I ain't shucking and jiving and high-fiving. You know this ain't back in the days, right? Well, I can't tell how the way they kill Freddie Gray, right?
Freddie Gray for today's broadcast, dedicated to the memory of Dr. Shani Mott. Talked about her earlier this year a few times. In fact, specifically, Dr. N.D.B. Connolly, he came to Seattle, Washington to talk about, of course, the system of white supremacy, economics specifically, in his family lineage, new book, great details. But during that conversation, and he had been a guest here at the Cows prior to me seeing him at the University of Washington this spring. But I said, hey, he's going to be right in my backyard. I got to go visit, right? So I'm there front row, get to ask a question and all of that. But he shares during the course of the dialogue that his wife, Dr. Shani Mott, they had children together and everything, that she passed away. I was stunned. She was only 43, mother of 3. I was absolutely stunned. And I had seen her. I was even more stunned because I'd seen her on television. She and Dr. Connolly, they are homeowners, and they had their house appraised. Something talking about in our program today, but they had their property appraised, and I think it was something, we'll call it $250,000. They took down all their Negro culture and pictures of themselves and their children, anything associated with black people. Throw all that in the trash. They got some white people to come and pretend to be the property owners and put up white artwork, and the value of the property increased by about $200,000, $300,000, just no longer being associated with black owners. Eep, and they made a big report about this and all the rest of it, and spotlighting the very racism that both of these scholars talk about in their academic careers. And I remember saying, after I found out about this, one, I was able to go up and give him my condolences in person, and just, you know, man. And then I went and saw online, like, oh man, they did report this online, I just didn't see it, and all the rest of it. But certainly condolences to Dr. Shani Mott's family, N.D.B. Connolly, mother of 3. And in fact, I said this year when I learned about her passing, I said, man, how much of a factor do you think racism was in taking away a black mother of 3 at this young age? I said, in fact, do you think if I'm a mother of 3 black children and we lose approximately $300,000 in the value of our property because of white supremacy, does that have a health impact, you think? Dr. Shani Mott, victim of racism for sure, and N.D.B. Connolly, tremendous scholar. You can hear him in the archives, read his books, excellent scholar. He's quoted in the very book that we are talking about today. The audio that we heard in the beginning, since we're talking about Baltimore, man, President Trump has been talking about sending the National Guard to all of these no-count cities and already sending them out to a number of locations. But ooh-wee, he has been talking about Baltimore. It seems like he really is not a fan of Baltimore. Remember, he said it's a hellhole. They don't need no housing. They got a black governor, too, so that probably Westmore. I'm no fan of him, but he says, you got Westmore telling me to come and walk the no-count streets of Baltimore. He said they don't have no housing problem. That's not what the problem is. The problem is you got these hardcore criminals. Well, make sure I don't need no crab cakes, or I don't need Lamar Jackson them to make the playoffs. Cross Baltimore off my ledger of places to visit. The second report, as I was reading the book today discussing the history of racism and housing in Baltimore, and I got to the passage about the Baltimore Archdiocese and their involvement in trying to get just housing in Baltimore, and I said, oh man, wait a minute. The Baltimore Archdiocese, now I know I'm on the opposite side of the continent, but I do try to, at least keep up with the news a little bit. Said, haven't they had some of these scandals about sexual abuse for decades in the church, and they lied and hid it and knew about all of these allegations and didn't do anything to stop all of this? Yes, and I point this out because this has happened many, many times where we have been focused on and talking about racism, and somehow, frequently, it's been the Catholic Church. Remember, we were studying Buffalo, the 22 caliber killer, got a white man, Joey 22, going around killing black dudes specifically, and they can't catch him for all that time, much like Brown University. But this went on for a long period of time. And in Buffalo, they were talking about the involvement of the Buffalo Archdiocese. It was, wait a minute, some of the exact priests that they were talking about who got involved in the case, come to find out they've been accused of all of this sexual abuse, and the church knew about it and covered it up for years. And like I said, this has happened a number of times when we've been focused on racism, white supremacy. I'm just picking out patterns. If we're going to talk about Jeffrey Epstein every day, well, hey, Coach Travis Turner in Virginia, been on the lam for over 30 days, accused of molesting all of those children. Seattle legend Mary Kay Letourneau. I just pick out patterns of behavior, but that is one. If you're not familiar, the Baltimore Archdiocese, and even the pattern where they were doing the payouts, I said, wow, that sounds kind of reminiscent of the way that they were talking to some of these black property owners that have been victimized. The same kind of, give you a few nickels, maybe. Get over it. Get on out. Patterns. Anyway, broadcast for today here in Seattle, prior to the historic floods and rain and all the rest of it. Elliott Bay Bookstore, they have a number of authors. Reading is more important than watching television. But Elliott Bay Bookstore, they frequently have authors who will come and talk about their brand new books, and frequently they will be about racism. I think I've done a number of visits there over the years because they have so many authors come to speak about racism. One that I missed recently, was really bummed about, they were talking about the history of deliberate racism in Baltimore, Maryland, and specifically the proposal to build this highway and how it disrupted a whole neighborhood of black people, black homeowners, and just, wow, I mean, that's, hey, why would I not want to check that out? Other than I don't really have any direct connects to Baltimore, but I'm always interested in learning about racism. Plus, this is such a familiar story where we've talked about this in so many other locations, to deliberately practice racism, or if you have some uppity black people who've got on your nerves, protesting, that sort of thing. Rosa Parks has got on your nerves, that sort of thing. Fine, we'll build a highway and run it right through her living room and no more Rosa Parks, that sort of thing. We've talked about this a number of times. Very sad but routine story. Racial dislocation, but this is specific to Baltimore, and we've not talked about that region enough. Maybe with the exception of Freddie Gray. Shout out Freddie Gray. And remember the lead poisoning? Even some of what's in this text reminded me, oh yeah, Freddie Gray was a victim of lead poisoning. That right there, the shabby living conditions of people in Baltimore. Yes, it has been made a hellhole for people classified as black, but much of the text we're reading today would say it has been done deliberately as a part of the system of white supremacy. That brand new text, I say, hey, there are so many books about racism that are published all the time. Like, you would be absolutely amazed just constantly. I'm sure there were some books that were published just this week that are explicitly about racism, and some of them have a lot of great details like this one. But brand new, the title, A Road to Nowhere, How a Highway Map Wrecked Baltimore, and deliberately so, chock full of wonderful information. The author, she is a historian of U.S. cities, schools, and segregation. Fascinating. Sounds like a lot of study of racism right there. And she is a graduate of Brown University. How apropos, sadly, for everything that's happening right now. Joining us live to discuss her great new book, Professor Emily Lieb. Ms. Lieb, you're with us?
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for hanging out with us. Am I saying your name correctly? Lieb? Is that your name?
Yep, that's exactly right. That's
awesome.
Exactly right. I answer to anything, but that's right.
Right on. For listeners who this might be their first time, they have not read your great book about Baltimore, just if you'd like to give us some brief background information about who you are and the great work that you do.
Sure. So I, as you said, I'm a historian here. I live here in Seattle now. But I'm a historian of cities and schools and really segregation. And as you say, the ways in which the cities that we live in now, we very carefully and deliberately built, right? They say that you can tell you can tell whether or not a system is working by like what its results are, right? So none of the things that we are seeing around us in the cities that we live in are accidents. They are the result of very careful choices that we have made. So many years ago now, when I was getting my PhD at Columbia in New York, I was doing something else. I was working on something else, and I happened to just be in Baltimore at the Baltimore City Archives, which are really wonderful city archives. And at that time, you could sort of go into the stacks and kind of like rough rifle through the stuff that was back there, which is pretty rare. They don't let you do that anymore. But as I say in the book, I came across a box of photographs, and a couple of them I think are reproduced here in the book. And they were labeled like Baltimore City Department of Housing and Community Development, and they were dated like 1969, 1970, 1971. And they were pictures of houses that were falling apart. And that's sort of, in this time, it's the early 2000s-ish, mid-2000s. It's sort of like the time of The Wire. It looked like, I think, the photos looked like, I think people sort of just assumed that Baltimore looked, right? The sort of pop culture narrative of Baltimore is like vacant houses falling apart. And that's what these pictures were of. But I knew enough about Baltimore architecture to know that these houses were not very old. The photos were from around 1970, as I said, and the houses were built clearly in the late teens, 20s, 30s. They weren't super old houses. They were built to be really good houses, right? They were, Baltimore had a couple of really prolific row house builders in the early 20th century, and they built houses to be like sturdy, beautiful, good houses for families to live in. These were set back from the street. They had these lawns and gardens. They had great front porches. They had big windows. They were really nice houses. And so I was like, well, this is strange because I know that these houses are not old. I know they were built, not very long ago for middle-class families to buy and live in. I know this is a really kind of nice, like, location in Baltimore. It's right next to they had addresses on them. So I could see they were sort of right next to this big, beautiful park. And so it was like, well, what exactly am I looking at here in these pictures? Like, why are these houses falling apart? There's no reason for these houses to have been falling apart, right? And really, this book is an answer to that question. It's like, what happened to these houses? And, more importantly, as you say, why did it happen to these houses? And the answer turns out to be that the city of Baltimore very deliberately created a Black homeowners neighborhood, middle class homeowners neighborhood out here in West Baltimore in the 50s and 60s, and then very deliberately sought to destroy that neighborhood by building an expressway right through the middle of it, which they ultimately did not do. But as I say in the book, right, a map. This book is really about the power of a map. It's about the power of a highway map alone to cause enormous harm to this neighborhood that people lived in and loved, and these homes that I saw in the pictures that people had lived in and loved. And then, you know, what happened after we can talk a little bit later about what happened after they decided not to build this expressway. But it was sort of, in the book, I call them three swindles, 3 times. The people, the black homeowners who lived in this community in West Baltimore, which is now known as Rosemont, were robbed. This neighborhood was very deliberately and carefully, and successfully, right, drained of its wealth, by powerful people, by policymakers, by bankers, by builders, by construction companies, by sort of real estate interests, right? There was an enormous amount of wealth here, and it was stolen, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And that's really, you know, what this book is all about.
Much obliged for the thorough description. We'll try to read a few passages and chat it up about all of this research and why you put this project together. I guess we start most of our broadcasts, one, for folks who have not seen you, and even to get at that pronoun we, about who constructed these cities, who is most to blame for the story that we're talking about. You are classified as a white woman, is that correct?
I am, yes. Yep.
Okay. For our broadcast, we use the term racism and the term white supremacy in your text, liberally so. For this broadcast, I use both of those terms as synonyms, and I use the same definition for both terms. That definition, a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you think such a system exists? Do you think that definition is accurate?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Hold on, I'm writing this down. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I sort of think about white supremacy in particular as being that system, right? And the engine of it is certainly racism. And I think you're right to sort of use these two things as synonyms. But I really think of white supremacy in the context of the public policies and stuff that I'm talking about in this book, as the sort of engine of, as you say, sort of systematic and thoroughgoing subjugation of people, and not just subjugation, but, you know, as I said, but robbery, right? Theft. This is what, you know, often, I'm sure that you've talked in previous episodes about the term racial capitalism, which is a sort of hot topic these days in history and social sciences. But sometimes whenever people ask me to explain what that means, I sort of just say, well, that's capitalism, right? Because as you say, the engine of all of this subjugation is racism, right? Is white supremacy, is a way of draining the resources that people have in order to enrich white people, white communities, and to build a world in which, you know, we can sort of, like, white people can sort of put on blinkers and pretend like they're the only ones who live in it. So yeah, I think that's your definition of it. Sounds great to me.
Right on. One thing that I will point out, I think this book is important. It has so much great information. And the pictures, I kind of neglected to highlight that, but I did really appreciate the pictures. Like, you get to see so many different black people from, like, middle of the 20th century, black Baltimore residents and such, black homeowners.
Yeah.
And then you get to see some of these wacky maps, like, we are going to knock all this stuff down. Like, it is amazing, some of the images that she was able to get from the archives. I guess if I could get in one quickly, since I have hung out in a few archives, were the people working at these archives who make the decision about what you can rummage through and what you can't, Were they white people, non-white people, a little bit of all of the above?
Oh, they were at the time. Well, the reason I was allowed to rummage, which again I have to say they don't let you do anymore at the Baltimore City Archives, which is good. That is good archival practice. But the reason at the time that I was allowed to rummage is that there wasn't really anybody working there for reasons of disinvestment and sort of. But so there was one guy who worked there, and he was like sort of holding down the whole ship. And that's why I was allowed to rummage. But yes, to answer your question, he was a white person. He was not a trained archivist. So I think certainly what you're getting at here is I think accurate that, and now that the archive, the majority of the staff, but not all, but the majority of the staff archivists in Baltimore are I think white identified people. And for sure, the field of archives, right? So I don't want to sort of the first gentleman who worked there was not a trained archivist; he was just a city employee. But for sure, the archives field really struggles, as you can imagine, with its incredibly sort of exclusionary. I think people have assumed for a long time, correctly, that it is an incredibly exclusionary field, and frankly racist in many of its practices, has historically been, for sure, and it is now, I think, really trying to remedy that situation in a lot of ways. I think some maybe more successful than others, but yeah, the people who worked there were white, and most of the materials that they have in the Baltimore City Archives are obviously materials produced by the city of Baltimore. And so most of the materials in that archive were public records, were city records, or state records, the state highway department, were produced by white people for other white people. There were a lot of those sort of great voices I was able to pull into this book came from letters that Black homeowners and residents of this Rosemont neighborhood wrote to the city. So that was a place in that archive where there were some Black voices. But for the most part, in that archive, it's really, documents produced by white people to explain to other white people what it is that they're doing, like they're moving chess pieces around on a board, right? Like they're doing two Black people, in this case. And so that is something, when you're in a city archive, right, that's sort of what you're getting. I was very fortunate. Baltimore has a really great, sort of community of archives and archivists, and the University of Baltimore has a really wonderful Baltimore study. It's called the Baltimore Studies Archive, and all listeners should go get thee to the Baltimore Studies Archive. It's wonderful. And they have collections from community groups around the city, and that's where I got a lot. That's where I got those great photos of the Neighborhood Improvement Association, the party photos. There were so many. I was so sad that I couldn't use more of those great photos of like the people dressed up at parties and just like the beautiful clothes. It's like I love looking at mid-century stuff, right? Mid-century clothes, mid-century hair. And those photos were just incredible. And so the Rosemont Neighborhood Improvement Association, which was an association that was formed by the Black homeowners who started to move into this neighborhood. In fact, they gave it its name. The Neighborhood Improvement Association gave Rosemont its name in the early 1950s. They kept incredibly meticulous records. That organization still exists, and they still do keep really good records, but they kept really meticulous records in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and those records now are at the University of Baltimore in the Baltimore Studies Archive. So that was one place that I was able to kind of get a perspective on what was going on in Rosemont and what went on in Rosemont, and an analysis of it, right? Because the people in the Rosemont Neighborhood Improvement Association and their neighbors knew exactly what was happening to them, and they knew exactly why, right? So it wasn't like a mystery. Why are we being targeted? Why is the city targeting us for destruction like this? They knew exactly why, and so that was a great place to get the what I consider to be the sort of heart of the book is that story of the neighborhood and the people who live in it. then I also have to always shout out. Then this is sort of a general. I don't know what future historians are going to do as we lose really great local journalism. But both the Baltimore Sun, but particularly the Baltimore Afro-American, which is the oldest Black newspaper in the country and a really wonderful one. They did extraordinary reporting. They had reporters on the ground that people trusted, that people talked to. They weren't just kind of reporters parachuting in and then leaving. They had a really good context for the stories that they were writing. And so that was another really invaluable source to me as I was writing this book is the Afro-American and the Afro archives, which still exist. And they are also a really extraordinary folks who work there and a really great resource for the city. So Baltimore has a really great set of historical resources that aren't just, white officials talking to white officials, but if you look, you can find the voices of people who are not just white officials talking to other white officials.
Okay. For the text, Road to Nowhere, who was your intended audience for this text? Was this something that was just intended for other academics to read, research about redlining and such, or did you have this as, general audience book where lay folks, Black people even, can read and learn about the history of racism in Baltimore?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. Thank you for asking it. Yes, I was, when I started writing this book, I was a history professor at Seattle University here in Seattle. But I never, and I'm not anymore now. I'm just a writer. But I've never been the kind of historian who wanted to just talk to other academics and other historians. they're not that interesting. So I really wanted. It was super duper important to me when I was writing this book to write a book that was rigorous and that was well researched and well sourced, right, and very careful, but that was, and I hope I achieved this, that was readable, that is something that is sort of general interest, because exactly as you say, people, and I think it, honestly, a lot of the story, as I say in the book too, like this is a story about Baltimore, but it is also a story about processes that happened in cities across the United States. And so I really hope that that people and the people that I know in Rosemont that still live there have been incredibly helpful and kind, and they have read the book and liked it. And so for sure, it is not my hope that this is a book that kind of just echoes around a bunch of historians and sociologists or something. It really is a book that people read, people kind of can use it to better understand not only what happened to Baltimore, but also what happened in their own neighborhoods and communities, and maybe learn to ask. Maybe what they will. It is my hope. It is always my hope when I teach, when I write, that what people will get out of it is like the tools to ask better questions, right? The tools to look around themselves and think like, wow, what is happening here? And why did it happen? And to start figuring out how maybe to answer those questions. There's a wonderful historian in Chicago named Sarah Doherty, and whenever she gives talks, often when she gives talks, she starts with a question to the audience, where do you live, why do you live where you live? And that is a really incredible way to start a conversation about anything, and to audiences of all ages, right? Like everybody has a neighborhood, and a lot of people don't really think about why it is that they live where they live, and why it is that their neighborhood looks the way that it looks. And so it's my hope that this book will help, again, even if it doesn't, it answers some of those questions for, this neighborhood in West Baltimore. I'm hoping that it enables readers, here in Seattle and nationwide to at least to start chipping away at what might be an answer to that question. Like, why do I live where I live? Why does it look how it looks? What are the very, as you say, very deliberate processes that created this place, and what were they trying to accomplish?
Context of White Supremacy. Dr. Emily Lieb discussing her book, Road to Nowhere, How a Highway Map Wrecked Baltimore. I'm picked out, generally our format, I'll read a few snippets from the text or ask a few questions based on some of the portions that really stood out and kind of get your thoughts. We'll see if our listeners have any questions while we have you. And one of the, right at the beginning of the book, this is in the introduction under the subheading, The Ruins of a Once Great City, you write, Urban History, N.D.B. Connolly writes in his afterword to a recent reprinting of Arnold R. Hirsch's classic Making the Second Ghetto, Race and Housing in Chicago, 1940 to 1960, illustrates how white terrorism gets both abstracted and focused through wrecking balls and bulldozer blades. It also shows how white terrorism needs only the idea of those tools to do its job. Since Hirsch first published his book in 1983, historians have been working to explain the many ways cities segregated second ghettos were, as Hirsch put it, continually renewed, reinforced, and reshaped. Some have explained how policymakers at every level redefined local housing markets and consecrated the connection between white Americans' ideas about race and the politics of property ownership. Others have shown how these same toxic ideas built and buoyed entire economies of exploitation around black property and its owners, and how they shaped the infrastructures that made that exploitation look natural, even inevitable. Powerful opening. I was struck by many portions. One is like, there's our old buddy N.D.B. Connolly again, his departed wife, Dr. Shani Mott, victim of white supremacy. But I was stuck in so much of this book. It reminds me of Beryl Satter's work, Family Property. She's talking about Chicago. She was also a guest on our platform, but same thing, different city. But she also, I asked her the same question because one of the first chapters in her book, she uses the metaphor. She says, a noose around the neck of Chicago. And I said, wow, you're using the terms of lynching to talk about deny. And it's the exact same thing. You give black people the worst, most dilapidated housing, and you charge them like 1,000% what the property is worth. And then if you miss one payment, throw them out on the street and you start all over again. You lost all, but even if you've 99% of it paid, it doesn't matter. Get out of here. And you get another black family and do the same thing, and maybe you charge them even more and do the whole thing over again, and just we carted all this money out of Negro Chicago. And I asked her, I said, wow, terrorism, is that accurate to call this terrorism? So what we're going to hear about in Rosemont, is it accurate to call this terrorism?
No, that's a really good question. I would say yes. I mean, I think it's certainly, as I say, it's certainly theft. It's certainly, the sort of highway robbery as both a metaphor and a literal description of what happened. I do think that the sort of aspects of terrorism, this is, in my opinion, this is it's incredibly violent, right? Like stealing someone's home is an act of violence. And also the way in which the people who had the power in Baltimore, so white policymakers, white kind of real estate men, mostly men, and sort of mortgage bankers, et cetera, were certainly using fear as a tool to get the black homeowners who lived in Rosemont to do what they wanted, right? So they weren't threatening, when we say like threatening violence, this was not an example of the kind of violence that happened earlier in Baltimore in every other city in the United States where black homeowners were shot, were stabbed, were dragged out of their houses, their houses were burned, right? They weren't trafficking in that kind of sort of the threats, right? The threats that they were trafficking in were, functionally, we're going to steal either everything you have or, as you said in the beginning of this show, right, everything you have minus like some little bit of money that we're going to throw your way, right? So what they were sort of getting people to do what they wanted them to do. So leave Rosemont in the case of the expressway plans, and leave their houses for pennies on the dollar. And they were doing that by preying on this sense of you will lose we will take everything that you have if you don't do what we want you to do. And I think it's also really important to say that in the case of Rosemont, right, lots of other places in Baltimore, there, exactly what you said happened in Chicago happened, right? There were sort of the folks that we'll talk about why, were like residential segregation was incredibly intense. Black homeowners and renters were really confined to very small parts of the city. And so the housing stock that was available to them was not only, incredibly expensive, right, because just sort of basic supply and demand, incredibly expensive, incredibly exploitative sort of landlord relationships. And also because of all those things, not great housing, right, crowded. Landlords weren't taking care of it, right? Rosemont, though, I think it's really important to note because the people who lived there, this was very important to them, right? I mean, but it also is true that Rosemont was not that. Rosemont was certainly, the way, particularly as I say in the book, Jim Crow schools shaped and steered Black migration out into what was sort of a streetcar suburban part of West Baltimore. And certainly, as we'll talk about, the people who bought those houses, the Black families who bought those houses in the 50s and 60s, were robbed coming and going, right? They had to pay much more for their houses. They had to pay much more for the money that they borrowed to buy those houses than comparably situated white families did. But this was a beautiful neighborhood. These were really nice houses. These were houses that people really I mean, this was in many ways in the 50s and 60s, despite, and sort of, really deliberately in spite of all of the things that the city of Baltimore and powerful white Baltimoreans did to try to exploit and rob the people who lived in Baltimore. It was a really kind of typical suburban kind of neighborhood, right, in the 50s and 60s. It was, when you think about the sort of 1950s, what does the like bicycles everywhere, like kids everywhere, people are gardening, people are really particular about their houses, right? These people who lived in Rosemont, the Rosemonters, the people who started the Rosemont Neighborhood Improvement Association, and cared so much about their houses. These were, pretty typical, like they were just middle-class people living middle-class lives in middle-class houses. So the houses themselves in the beginning, they had left kind of overcrowded, substandard housing conditions in the older parts of Baltimore and come to this new part of Baltimore. And again, they knew they were being taken advantage of. They knew that, their choices were limited, but they were also really excited and proud to be there because it was a real mark of success and achievement to be able to buy a house in a neighborhood like Rosemont, to be able to live in a community like Rosemont. The pictures of the people in the book that, the we workers and we wives, like they were very, it's the 50s, right? They're like very worked up about, is your grass like a tiny bit too long or is your paint like a little bit chipped, right? They were very interested and committed to keeping up these houses and this community that they loved so much. So this was an escape from the kind of bad housing conditions that had prevailed, and that still did prevail for poorer people in the older parts of Baltimore. This was, in many ways, a very, a sort of ideal kind of suburb to live in.
She points out in the book, Dr. Lieb, that there were higher rates of home ownership in Rosemont with these black homeowners than in the greater population in Baltimore, just to attest to these folks were not scoundrels who were skipping out on payments, like they were working hard, even paying exorbitant prices. They were doing as much as they could to have a, I won't say community, but a nice place to live for given the conditions. But I did want to offer, because the question I was asking was about, is this terrorism? And you said yes, and you were explaining the violence of taking all of this, where people have worked so hard to try to build something, and to just snatch all of that for white people, where you were talking about they weren't exhorting to explicit violence. Well, this is on page 22. You write, nobody felt safe. Everybody felt exploited as far as Old West Baltimore's white homeowners were concerned. Public policy was supposed to protect their interests, not the interests of black Baltimoreans, and not the interests of the real estate sharps whose actions seemed to threaten the value of their most significant asset. In the breach, many turned violent, feeling that there is no law under which they can prevent further inroads. The Sun reported in 1913, the white people of West Baltimore have openly declared they will use their own methods, restoring white branded blocks by disposing of the unwelcome neighbors. Mobs paid by local improvement and protective associations catapulted rocks, bricks, marbles, and rotten vegetables through the windows of black-owned houses. They dumped old garbage on stoops and splashed paint on the doors and windows. They sawed off someone's front porch and tipped it into the street. Had to pause and read that one a few times, like, what?
Yeah.
Woo!
Yeah.
Everywhere in West Baltimore, houses burned, even houses on legally colored blocks, even houses on mixed blocks that had been black owned for years. On Mother Street that September, one black woman was shot in her house while her neighbor was stabbed in the street. All of that to say that, I mean, hey, metaphor or no, highway or no, the white violence is always right there.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And this, so the segment that you just read was describing events that happened in the 19-teens. So like a generation and a half maybe before people moved to Rosemont. But yes, absolutely, the specter of that kind of violence and the memory of that kind of violence lingers and is like sort of exists over everything. So yes, you're absolutely right that even in the 1950s, when the sort of the kind of violence that is enacted on, again, the people who, the middle class home buyers who moved to Rosemont, whose experience was not the same as the experiences of most other black people in Baltimore, by virtue of the fact that they had more money. The sort of threat of that, right? They certainly were aware of what their white neighbors could and would do, right? The sort of sense that Baltimore had of itself was that in the sense that Baltimore had of itself by the 1950s, and we'll rewind a little bit in a minute, but was of this kind of, we're a southern city, but we are not, Montgomery, we're not Birmingham. We are this incredibly civilized, sophisticated, sort of multiracial city in which we all, love our neighbors. We just don't love them, in our neighborhoods, right? It was this, so that's the narrative that the story that white Baltimore was telling about itself, starting in, the 40s, 50s, and 60s and onward. But yeah, you're 100% right that the people every black person who lived in Baltimore, I think historians never say every, but I will say every, in this case, was aware of, just the way that the city could turn on them, and the way that the city could turn on them in ways that were not sort of financially violent, but actually violent, as you describe here. The thing about Baltimore is that Baltimore was a real pioneer in a lot of the tools and technologies that other cities across the country used to try and segregate their neighborhoods, particularly in the progressive era. And one of the things that's being described in this passage that you just read is what Baltimore did was they were the first city in the country to pass in 1911 what was called a residential segregation ordinance, which was a law that said that, you know, where, and that's what when I'm talking about legally quote colored blocks and legally quote mixed blocks, those were the terms that the law used to describe, you know, who could and couldn't live in a place, right? And so when it seemed like that law was failing, which it failed immediately because it was stupid and like, you know, it was morally disgusting and also practically, you know, incredibly dumb. The people that had the city was like reassuring whites with these laws by using Jim Crow schools to segregate neighborhoods, by using things like restrictive covenants to segregate neighborhoods. That was the city of Baltimore reassuring reassuring white Baltimoreans that the city of Baltimore was going to protect their interests, right? Their property interests, what they owned, their neighborhoods, their houses, their communities, and that they were going to do it at the expense of their black neighbors. And so when that seems to be failing in the 19-teens, that is one of the many moments at which you know the sort of white people, ordinary white Baltimoreans turned, as you say, like literally violent, not just like sort of I'm going to steal your stuff, but I'll stab you, I'll burn your house down. And so that is for sure, exactly as you say, the backdrop behind, or the context for what happened in Rosemont in the 1950s and 60s, and why everybody who lived in Rosemont, again, everybody is not supposed to say, so let's say most everybody who lived in Rosemont was so able to recognize the sort of state's, you know, violent intentions when it came time to steal their houses for the expressway, right? The highway builders weren't threatening, they weren't like coming to your door and saying, if you don't move, I'll burn your house down, or if you don't move, we'll stab your kid, right? But they were saying, if you don't move, sort of ellipsis, right? Like, if you don't move, something bad's going to happen. If you don't move, you're going to lose everything that you have worked for, everything that you love. And so, yeah, that kind of violence, that kind of terrorism is always the backdrop. It's always the subtext. Sometimes it becomes text, but it's always subtext.
I think it's so important, even one of the massive themes, at least for me, I don't know what other folks have told you from reading this book, but at least for me, one of the massive themes was, wow, white people are massively informed about racism. And I mean massive. It is so glaring, like reading this book, even to the point when you use the term that white people have their blinders or blinkers on, so they're not really, I've heard that metaphor before, suggesting that white people don't really have to pay attention to racism or what have you. Whew, reading this book, just even the passage that I read from the very beginning where you said the ghettos, that they have to be renewed, reinforced, and reshaped. Oh man, you cannot be colorblind or blinded or blinkers or unaware. You might have to get a magnifying glass to get really, let's get down on the granular level and talk about how we're going to plot out the ghetto and where Leroy is going to be living, or if he'll even be allowed to live here for like the next 50 years. That's what I see in this book, like over and over. And even with, we focus so much on terms and definitions. I gave my definition for racism. This is at the bottom, same page that I had to go down and come back. So after all the violence, this is back to 13 at the bottom of it. You write, as far as the city of Baltimore was concerned, those people were the only ones who mattered. Whatever powerful white Baltimoreans said they thought their city should be or serve or do, their ideology boiled down to this: everything you have belongs to us. One of their weapons was a word, blight. What it meant could be anybody's guess. Woof! And that was the point. Take the brain-twisting definition the Baltimorean Urban Renewal and Housing Authority presented in a 1964 report. There are probably almost as many definitions of blight as there are people knowledgeable in urban problems, Burha said. However, underlying all these different definitions is a common theme. This theme is that many attributes are associated with a blighted area that are not ordinarily found in unblighted areas. But, as had been in Jacksonville, those many attributes were often just one. Did black people call a place home, or didn't they? Blight, black, black, blight. And the money doesn't really matter. Upkeep of that. Black, blight. That I thought was so masterful. And that's another really skillful illustration. You can't have blinders on and then you just get these old tricky words that are very deliberately nebulous that can be used as a part of the violence against black, as part of that refined violence that you talk about, where nobody came necessarily and stabbed you or burned your house down. We just, hey, this is blight, you know, we're just doing this for the greater good.
Yeah, exactly. And that is a critically important piece of this, right? Because that idea of the notion of the greater good completely erases, I mean, approaching half of Baltimore by mid-century, right? Or certainly by the 60s. The idea that Baltimore was a city for white people, and increasingly white people who didn't even live in it, right? Like they're building, one of the reasons they're building this expressway is because they are trying to find a way to ferry white people who had moved into the suburbs back into downtown to go to work, to go to kind of the Charles Center, to go to the theater, to go to, you know, whatever, right? To go to Austin to get medical care. You mentioned Johns Hopkins and the lead. I mean, like Johns Hopkins is it's probably, I think, Baltimore's now biggest employer. But anyway, don't quote me on that. I think it's true, but I'm not totally sure. Anyway, the notion that the greater good requires erasing black people and sort of and again taking, not just erasing them, but taking what is theirs and making it, you know, giving it to white Baltimore. That is an assumption that is unquestioned, and it's again increasingly unstated, right? As the 20th century wears on, policymakers typically aren't making just openly racist kind of statements the way that they're doing in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, right? They have sort of figured out a way to kind of couch their language. It's a conversation that we have currently about zoning, right? The kind of euphemisms that we use when cities, Seattle is number one among them, use language about, like implement exclusionary zoning programs that don't say, no poor people. They don't say no black people, but that's what they mean, right? And so the idea that those things are, that the people who live in Baltimore aren't what's good for Baltimore. What's good for Baltimore is some uncritically, unquestioned, uncritical other thing that is like, let's replace what is blighted, which again, as you pointed out, is sometimes an aesthetic description. I think like listeners we all hear the word blight, and I think our brains kind of get a picture in it about what that means. But that's in fact, as Burha pointed out, not what it means, right? It just means like whatever isn't blighted. Well, thank you very much. That means nothing, right? And so the ability to point to anything and say, this is blighted, we're taking it, whether or not it looks like what, comes to mind maybe when we think about blight, or what in older parts of West Baltimore, housing conditions were bad. And so, often, there aren't adequate bathrooms, et cetera, houses are very old. But it's not that here. And so they sort of take this language that they devised to describe, and everybody's like, oh, yes, that's terrible, right? That the sort of progressive era housing reformers that went around and took pictures and made slideshows of this bad housing in Baltimore. That's not what this is, but that is the language that we are using to describe it. But more than that, it is the tool that we are using to take it. And that has nothing to do with who does or with like what actually looks like on the ground. It's just like, this is property that belongs to Black people. We can take it, and get rich. So we will do that. And did. And the tool that they used again was this word blight. But it was a tool. It wasn't, a precise description of anything at all. It was, a code word.
Context of White Supremacy. They have a number of those code words. You mentioned how some of the rationale for why this highway had to be constructed and had to go through Rosemont, allegedly, or where these Black people live, was ferrying white people who do not actually live in Baltimore to get them downtown so they can get back to doing some shopping and all this, or whatever it is that they think they're going to do in downtown Baltimore. And that, it reminded me of the passage. This is chapter 4. This is the bottom of page 59. You write, in July 1956, the year-old Greater Baltimore Committee, an organization of outstanding local business and industrial executives, formed a highway subcommittee to emphasize its conviction that a properly planned and coordinated highway program will be of immeasurable benefit to our city and its citizens. Whose city and which citizens? ? Besides being outstanding local business and industrial executives, most of the highway subcommittee's members didn't live in Baltimore at all. The subcommittee's chairman was Leonard J. Novograd, the general manager of the May Company department stores, who lived in a Tudor-style castle in Pikesville, just over the northwestern city line. Albert D. Hutzler, Jr., department store president, also lived in Pikesville, and so did Hugo Dalsheimer, the president of the Lord Baltimore Press. Then there were Bill Rouse, a mortgage banker, Roland Park, the prototypical in-town suburb, and his neighbor C. Warren Black, the president and chairman of a sand and gravel mining concern, the executive vice president of the Mercantile Safe Deposit and Trust Company, Towson, and the vice president of the United States Fidelity and Guarantee Company, Towson. Again, one of the things that I do now, since we've read James Lowen's Sundown Town, I just stop to check to see, hey, is this a sundown town, a place where they have deliberately prohibited Negroes? So I look for Towson, Maryland, Towson, and it says, while Towson, Maryland wasn't a classic overtly listed sundown town with explicit signs like some rural areas, it was part of a broader system of racial exclusion in the Baltimore area where Black people faced severe housing discrimination, intimidation, that sounds like violence again, and were expected to leave white neighborhoods after dark, which pretty much sounds like a sundown town.
A sundown town, yeah. It would seem to sound like that.
Anyway, preventing Black wealth accumulation through home ownership, as detailed in the research by James Lowen, but I'm just to echo your point about these white people, man, it seems like they don't even live here, and they're making all these decisions to totally destroy the lives of these Black tax-paying homeowners who do live in Baltimore proper and whatever. Get out of Maryland, really.
Yeah. Right, exactly. I mean, and it is the sort of idea that, again, that Baltimore is supposed to, the purpose of the city of Baltimore is to serve the interests of white people and white wealth. And as you say, like, some of those people live in the city and some of those people don't, and it doesn't matter to Baltimore at all, right? Baltimore is still, it's not even like, they're serving white Baltimoreans exclusively. These people don't live in Baltimore. Their money does. They're property owners downtown. And so part of the thing that they think that they're doing is making it, increasing the value of the property that they own by making it easier for people to get to it. But that's sort of two separate things, right? We can debate it. I have opinions about whether or not highways are ever necessary. I have really strong opinions about whether or not this highway was necessary. But the fact is that, that's one conversation. And the fact that it was treated as the same conversation as like, okay, so let's bulldoze these black neighborhoods to get it, is sort of is an interesting thing, right? As I say in the book, Baltimore had many plans for expressways. Baltimore could not get enough of hiring people and consultants to make plans for expressways, and map expressways was like its primary pastime in the 50s and 60s and the 40s. And before the school conversions turned the schools in Rosemont into schools for black students in the years immediately before Brown versus Board of Education ostensibly desegregated those schools. In the years before Rosemont became a black neighborhood, we can look at these maps that planners drew for this expressway that was it was known, I'll call it for the purposes of this conversation, the East-West Expressway. It had a million names. It's very confusing, but it ran sort of east-west, so that's what we'll call it. Every one of those, before Rosemont became a black neighborhood, every one of those maps turns the highway down and out of town well before. So those roads don't come anywhere near it. When Rosemont is a white community, those roads don't come anywhere near it, right? They, in fact, go through poorer black neighborhoods to the southwest, but that's a story for somebody else to tell. But it truly is like immediate that Rosemont becomes a black community in 1953, 1954, virtually overnight because of the machinations of the school board. And then almost immediately after that, surprise, there's a new highway map that takes that turn and bumps it up and out of town right through the middle of Rosemont. And subsequently, every single map the city drew for that east-west, some version of that east-west expressway, that east-west part of the expressway system, eviscerated Rosemont, except for ultimately one that in the end, when the folks who live in Rosemont and their sort of anti-road counterparts from around the city managed to get that road that would have eviscerated their neighborhood stopped, then the road builders sort of said, okay, well, we'll build another. We'll just map a new road that bumps a little bit to the south through below the neighborhood and through a cemetery that had been there all along. So again, we can sort of debate. I have opinions about whether or not this road was necessary. We can debate whether or not it should have. They should have. This was not in my opinion, this was not the way to be talking about how to improve transportation in a city. But the fact is that even if you stipulate that you needed this expressway, and even if you stipulated that it's a great idea to build an expressway that goes from downtown Baltimore out into the western suburbs, and even if you stipulated that it needed to be like at this kind of latitude, longitude, whichever it is, that sort of cuts through this older part of West Baltimore, it did not need to it never needed to destroy a house in Rosemont because that cemetery had been there the whole time. Now, again, it is not pleasant to live next. I'm not advocating for that that plan, right? It's not pleasant to live next to an expressway. It's not like that wouldn't have been a great outcome. But the fact is that, and that sort of gives us a clue, right, as to what the road builders were trying to accomplish with this road, because all along they could have simply said, we're going to build this road through this cemetery and not through these, black people's houses. But they didn't. They didn't do that because, as one black activist says that I quote in the book, I think, in my opinion, correctly, dead white bodies mattered more to Baltimore than live black ones. And I think that's certainly borne out, in my opinion, true, and certainly borne out in the conversations we see and the maps we see around these expressways.
You have a portion in the text that I think just makes that point so explicit. This is on page 70. You write, as far as most white people were concerned, as I had stated before, black and blighted became interchangeable adjectives. Buoyed by the transitive property, Baltimore's planners drew their maps accordingly. Because they had the bad luck to be sitting in between the suburbs and downtown, and because of their relative lack of political power in the city council and the state legislature, and because of the pervasive subconscious supposition that any black neighborhood must have been a blighted one, even places like Rosemont were vulnerable to being carved in two. Referring to a small change the Department of Planning made to its 1957 maps, one booster gave away the whole game. What a metaphor. Compared with the original route, he wrote, the new one was much improved. The neighborhood it would take now was inhabited by Negroes, is a slum, and is not considered much of a political obstacle. In brand and in fact, Rosemont had been a white neighborhood in 1942. Not one of the routes the advisory engineers suggested for the East-West Expressway that year came anywhere near it. It was a white neighborhood in 1943, and the same thing was true. It was a white neighborhood in 1945, in 1946, and in 1949. But by 1957, Rosemont was a black community. Now it was a target. Making the just explain. That's another one. In fact, I would take that, and it's much, that's later in the book, but earlier in the book, this is way back, might even be it's in the introduction, way back at the beginning of the text here. It goes back to white people cannot be ignorant about racism. This is black people start Great Migration. We read Warmth of Other Suns, Isabel Wilkerson, but you talk about the influx of black people coming into Baltimore, and of course they're going to need housing and they're going to need schools, big parts of the book. This is the bottom of 15. You write, only a few months before, the people who lived on the Corbett's block were all white. Now, just like Rosemont flipped over. Now, just like the newspaper said, many of those white people were selling and moving to Gwynn Oak, to Halethorpe, to Cantonsville, or just over the old Edmondson Avenue bridge to the other side of the park. Their impending departure made them better neighbors than they might otherwise have been. Everyone was very nice to me, Gertrude Corbett would later tell the Evening Sun, black female, because they wanted me to find someone to buy their house. According to that 1952 article, the school commissioners were baffled by the ingress of Negro homeowners and dwellers in hitherto white neighborhoods. But as Gertrude Corbett likely knew, this bafflement was itself a little baffling. Those commissioners were as responsible as anybody was for greasing black migration into white West Baltimore. And I think that, at least for me, I had to change my highlighter color there because I see so many different scenarios where white people feign and pretend, like, what? Where did the, oh my goodness. They even do that, the immigration thing, like, what? Where did these Latinos, oh my goodness, how did they, what? They get, come on, stop lying. You lay out eloquently in the book in so many different ways. Now, hey, you do need some white realtors to cooperate in all of this to sell the property and make money. I'm like, come on, what do you mean? I'm like, what? Where did the black people go? And I see that over and over. That's what I said. That was one of the main themes that I got from the book. White people cannot be ignorant about racism, even though there's so many examples. Even this is way back ancient history of white people pretended to want to be called, oh, what? I don't know what's going on with all these black people moving in. Like, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, to your point, I mean, I think that this is actually a really good example of the point that you're making because it takes a really remarkable habit of mind, I suppose, a really remarkable set of blinkers to pretend like you don't know that in this moment, right before 1954, that Jim Crow has created this neighborhood because there are literally signs over the doors of the schools that say who can go there. They say white or they say colored. The schools were the numbering system for schools in Baltimore. There were two separate like numbering systems. So, it was like PS 8 or PS, whatever, 189 or whatever it was, right? Like schools were numbered like there are in a lot of cities. And the numbers were different for white schools and for black schools. And so, how can you pretend? I mean, to your point, you make a really good point. How can you pretend that you don't know what the engine is for this kind of, this migration, this residential development, when you know where your kid goes to school, you know who your kid goes to school with, you know what the number is of that school, you know what it says over the door, right? You have to know that, that even if you don't want to call it, racism, right? Because God, as you point out, like God forbid that we call it racism, but you have to know that, that what I will call racism is the engine here because it says it on the wall of the building, right? Like this is, so to your point, it is a rather remarkable twist, like you have to twist yourself into quite a pretzel to tell yourself that like this is somehow just things just kind of happen, right? And the point that I make in the book, and one of the things actually that surprised me the most when I was writing this book, when I was doing research, was what a big role schools play in the story. And I think most of us think or understand, we sort of, if we understand that our schools are currently segregated and our neighborhoods are currently segregated, I think we sort of draw the arrow from like neighborhoods to schools. So I think we're like, well, and in Seattle, right, when in the conversations that around school desegregation in Seattle, the school superintendent says this all the time. She will not stop talking about how, yes, our schools in Seattle are segregated, but that's not our fault. It just happened, which is a lie. But, because our neighborhoods are segregated, therefore our schools are segregated, right? But what Baltimore's story shows us really starkly, and what is true, I would argue, for cities across the country, is that the arrow goes the other way, right? The reason our neighborhoods are segregated is that our schools are segregated, that the schools built the segregated neighborhoods, not segregated neighborhoods sort of like, whoopsie, I guess our school's segregated. Well, we can't do anything about that. Like, we just have to, pretend like we don't see it. Or if we do see it, we are like, very, in contemporary Seattle, right? Like we all, like everybody has a long face. Like, oh, isn't that sad? But there's nothing we can do about it. Well, there is, and there was, and this is the result of very conscious choices policymakers made about who was going to go to school where. But the fact is that it was the segregated schools. It was the choices in Baltimore's case that the school board made about what schools were about, making what they called school conversions, converting schools that had once served white pupils into schools that served black pupils. They built Rosemont, they built other black communities simply because, if you that's how they're steering, as I say, steering black migration into West Baltimore by converting schools to make it possible, to make that migration possible, which is why it's so, the school officials telling the paper that I just can't figure out how this happened. Well, it doesn't speak very well of your ability to pay attention, sir, because you did it, right? And so that, I think, is a really important piece, when we think about, as you say, right, we just sort of, the stories that we tell ourselves, I think, white people for sure, and also the kind of master narratives of our cities, is that, we have segregation, but it just happened, right? Or, we have this highway here, but it just happened, or whatever it is, right? We knocked down this neighborhood to build, a convention center, or whatever it is. No, that didn't just happen, right? We very deliberately did that. We very deliberately we made the choices that we made. We built the cities that we built. It's not an accident, and it is absolutely, and to claim that you don't understand, that to claim that this is not connected to racism, or to claim that you just, it was sort of to act like it's completely news to you, is preposterous. And in Baltimore, and the example that you chose here is so good because it's, it is a laughable claim because you literally know what the door of your kid's school says, right? So you can't pretend to be confused about that when you are sending your child to a segregated school, and you know that. So you know exactly what is going on here. You just don't want to name it.
Massive problem as to why we cannot get anything done about white supremacy, racism. I say that all the time. People say white people are ignorant about race. You cannot be and when I read that in Road to Nowhere, literally they have a specific numeric coding. These are the numeric codes for the schools for the white children. These are the numeric codes for the schools for the black children. Woo! And how much confusion can there be about what is happening here?
About this.
Come on.
Exactly.
Anywho.
And I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's. I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but again, what I was saying, Baltimore is pretty pleased with itself, wrongly, about its sort of progressive nature. We're not like Birmingham, we're not like Montgomery. When school starts in September of 1954, so when school starts, so the first Brown decision, ostensibly desegregating schools, came down in May of 1954. When school started in September of 1954, the Baltimore made this. I mean, you can't believe the patting themselves on the back, right? Because they only had, desegregation went super smoothly. There was only trouble, there was only, some ruckus around school desegregation in one tiny part of, sort of working class white Baltimore. The implication here is that, or not even implication, they say it, that, these poor white people, they are the violent ones. They're the ones who don't want to share their schools, with black students. Everybody else is just fine. But no, the fact was that 30 kids or something ended up sort of going to different schools than they had gone in 1953 because the segregation of the schools was already so complete that by the time that Brown ostensibly desegregated them, there wasn't anything to desegregate because neighborhoods were segregated and therefore schools were segregated, and therefore white Baltimore can be so pleased with itself around how well it handled the Brown decision, how easily it took Brown in stride, and how eager Baltimore was to open up all of its public facilities, huge lie, to black people, unlike people in other cities. because they were sort of like this bastion of, this wasn't really the South, right? Baltimore, this whole thing. It's like, well, we're the South, but not the South. But no, they had just done it so completely. They had accomplished segregation so completely before 1954 that they were then able to tell themselves this story about how all of this, has nothing to do with race. And you're right. Like, I don't see like sort of the way that white people are able to, as you say, like justify, every kind of white supremacist public and private action by claiming not to see what it is. But again, like, it's the sign, it's on the sign on the door. So you certainly do know what it is, and you certainly do know how it serves you. And you certainly are profiting from it. And to say that you can't see what it is you're profiting from is a lie. I mean, it's just a lie. This is a book about a bunch of lies, right?
Facts. Hey, master deceivers. That is a lot of what primary weapon of racism is, deception. And yes, this book is about a lot of lying. White people lying to black people, stealing their houses, and making a lot of money while lying to black people and practicing racism. This is at the bottom of page 30, and I was fascinated by this for many reasons, but it kind of gets back to my kind of central point here. You write, Rosemont was unusual, but it wasn't unique. According to the 1955 Maryland Commission on Interracial Problems and Relations study, about 15,000 houses in Baltimore out of some 278,000 total had shifted to non-white use since 1950. Almost all of those, the MCIPR said, had been purchased by black families to live in. By this math, people a lot like the new Rosemonters would soon occupy around 5% of the houses in Baltimore. Some black families, like the people moving to the Arcadian suburban boulevards of northeast Baltimore near Morgan State College, may have been a little more genteel, upper middle, not middle, or lower middle. Some, like those moving to the houses in the old Edmondson terraces, may have had a little less. Meanwhile, of course, the most common black experience in Baltimore was poverty. In the early 1950s, historian Jane Berger calculates more than half of all black Baltimoreans were poor. Plus, the exorbitant rents they had to pay made them disproportionately poorer than white households, and the bad housing conditions that resulted contributed to the general sense among wealthier people of all races that poor black people were trash. Woo, got to say that 2 times on the program this week. Riffraff, problems to be solved. But the black families who were moving into the 100-ish houses around the Rosemont Housing Improvement Association's block shared some version of their day-to-day experience with thousands of others. Again, talking about these are homeowners and the somewhat uniqueness of this neighborhood. But what stood out to me, and I've seen this sort of thing before, the Maryland Commission on Interracial Problems and Relations study. What in the world is that? Like, who paid for that? Like, what? Can you give us some details?
A little bit. I mean, I think this is funny because when I was in graduate school, I studied in part with the historian Barbara Field, who is a brilliant and wonderful writer. And she also wrote a really great book about enslaved people in and around in Maryland. So she's kind of a historian in Maryland. Her dissertation was about that. But the point if there's one thing that you remember if you work with Barbara Fields, it's that when anybody says, racial or race relations, right, that what they mean is racism. You mean racism. That is, if you just swap out the word race relations for racism, that will give you a much more accurate picture of what is really going on, right? So when we're talking about interracial problems and relations, it is a sort of interesting, it's a way, as you say, of sort of depersonalizing it, right? Like, this isn't people being racist. This isn't a whole city organized around the like systematic expropriation of black wealth. This is just an interracial problem, right? This is just a relations problem. This isn't like uncut white supremacy. So that is an interesting, like the euphemism of race, the word race relations, is something that I will never, ever forget from that. And that came straight from the wonderful and brilliant Barbara Fields. But yeah, I think that the Maryland Commission on Interracial Problems and Relations, I don't remember very much about it. I believe it was a, I think there was some white Quaker, so the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker organization, was fairly active in identifying and sort of pushing back against housing discrimination and other kinds of discrimination in Baltimore. I think the NAACP was also represented on that commission. I think that it was a fairly I think that's a legitimate. Their report is legitimate. The count that they made is legitimate. I don't think that this is some sort of like propaganda on their part. I think they were trying to document, as they say, interracial problems, which was the language of the time, and also an incredibly neutralizing language that made it sort of okay for, it made white people can feel okay about it, I think. But yeah, that I think that was, I'm thinking it's the Front Service Committee. I'm thinking it's the NAACP, and some other kind of, middle class people who are kind of thinking of the, it's just a sort of standard middle class kind of reform organization. I believe, but I don't remember the details, so I could be 1,000% wrong.
Much obliged. It seems so formal, and even that's another one that would seem like it would have to be a number of white people involved to have some, because you would generally for a study like that you'd have to have financing to who's going to go and do all this research and publish and get together, give a presentation. Like, white people are not ignorant about, I don't think the black members of Rosemont got together to commission a study on race relations.
And they certainly didn't. No, in fact, they did not. Right, and they would. I don't think they would have called it race relations. But yeah, absolutely. I believe this is a group that it was sort of a stuffy academic group, and this is probably more white members than black members. I think it had some black members. I'm pretty sure it did. But yes, it was certainly a white. A white, and I think, a sort of in this case, I think a sort of well-meaning white people kind of thing, right? They were trying to identify. They were getting kind of closer to what the problem might have been than some of their other white counterparts, but they weren't quite there, right? And to your point, I think the black people on the commission and the black people who weren't on the commission knew perfectly well. They didn't need to commission a study about it, right? But that was not the kind of argument necessarily that the Commission on Interracial Problems and Relations, and to say that, again, to sort of to call it, it's like an interracial problem. It's not, the problem isn't that white people are racist, right? It's some kind of other like fuzzy interracial problem. Like, who can say what it might be? So yeah, to your point, yes, that's correct.
Context of White Supremacy. Just, wow, so formal. Might even be worth, that would be something, if you could rummage and get through the archives, that would be worth flipping to read a little bit. Let's see, folks, we have folks in the Maryland area, if you have a question, what we've been chatting about. Never mind. Fresh Princess in Philly, right up the road. If you have a question for Dr. Emily Lieb, you should be with us.
Thank you for allowing me to speak, Gus. Good evening, Dr. Lieb. I am originally from Philadelphia, but I've been in Baltimore for over 20 years. Did you come across any information in your research about Northeast Baltimore, particularly redlining around in areas adjacent to Towson, specifically Idlewood, Idlewide, and Stoneleigh? And also, did you come across any information about Johns Hopkins claiming eminent domain on housing around the hospital and not the university? And I'll mute my line. Thank you.
Oh, yes. So great questions. The first and most flippant answer is no. I don't know the first thing about East Baltimore. Whatever goes on in East Baltimore is a complete mystery to me, which I gather is occasionally true of even people who live in Baltimore, but that's me being flip. I think that in this book, I think a lot of the patterns that I talk about, a lot of the ways that not even redlining, but real estate speculation, right, was a citywide engine of displacement, of expropriation, of robbery, right? There were a couple of big speculators and speculative kind of real estate conglomerates in the city of Baltimore. They owned, so a speculator is for listeners who don't know, what happens if you can't get, the Federal Housing Administration was a New Deal, I'm rewinding, a New Deal program by the federal government that was designed to make it easier for people to get into houses and to buy houses. And the tools that it used, it kind of invented the mortgage as the federally insured mortgage that we know today, right? It's a full self-amortizing 30-year, relatively low interest mortgage. For reasons that boil down to racism, but for reasons that involve, if people are familiar with redlining, like the redlining maps of cities, most of those loans were not available. Almost, in I think 98% of FHA insured loans and VA loans from the Veterans Administration were given to white people. So, and that was, again, very deliberate on the part of the people who wrote the policy. So who steps into the breach are people called real estate speculators, and what they do is they buy houses. They sort of scare. They buy houses from white people who live in them, often by scaring them into leaving. But they buy houses pretty low prices from white buyers, and then they sell those same houses at like incredibly inflated rates to black buyers. And then they also are the source of the financing for the houses. So you get your mortgage not from a bank, but from the speculator from whom you bought the house, usually through a savings and loan that's sort of a straw savings and loan that really is the guy that you bought the house from. And so you pay that. So that's what I mean when I say you pay more for your house, and then you pay more for the money that you bought, that you used to buy that house, right? You pay much more for the loan itself than a comparably situated white family would. Those patterns, those processes are not unique to Rosemont. They're not unique to West Baltimore. They happen citywide. The speculators operate citywide. So like there's a guy named Sheldon Goldsecker who owns a bunch of real estate companies and a bunch of kind of shell banks, and he operates citywide. There's a couple of just really 5 or 6 big speculative firms in Baltimore, and they all operate citywide. So if you went looking to see what happened in those neighborhoods in Northeast Baltimore, I think that you could sort of pull some of the threads that I get at in this book about the way speculation worked in this part of West Baltimore. I think you could look at that would at least be a template for understanding what happened in those neighborhoods in Northeast Baltimore. I cannot say for sure because, again, I really don't know. I cannot say with any kind of authority anything about East Baltimore. But I think that the template for the way that that black migration happened, that black homeownership happened, I think it works citywide. So you can get a lot of that from this book and then sort of see how it works or doesn't for those parts of Northeast Baltimore. Likewise, around the Hopkins Hospital, I don't know a huge amount about it, but certainly the kind of language that we're talking about here, the kind of made-up language of quote-unquote blight, the use of, as you say, eminent domain, which is another sort of, there's 2 big Supreme Court cases in 1954. Everyone knows about Brown versus Board. Nobody knows about Berman v. Parker, which is the other one, which is the one that basically enables eminent domain on a massive scale. So before 1954, you could lose your house for eminent domain, but you had to the person, the city, the agency that was taking it had to sort of prove that they were doing it for a good reason. After 1954, the Supreme Court said, go for it. You don't even need really a reason, right? And so those processes, again, the things that happened in West Baltimore around the East-West Expressway are the same processes that happened in East Baltimore, starting around, I think, this time, and then continuing, obviously into the present, of displacement, of using the language of blight, of deliberately creating blight and then pointing to it as the reason why you're taking people's houses, taking people's neighborhoods, right? Arguing that the Johns Hopkins Hospital is better for Baltimore than the neighborhood that it replaced, right? All of those things, again, I'm not the expert on the details there, but I certainly can confidently say that the patterns that I write about in this book that happened in West Baltimore around urban renewal, around displacement, around theft happened. Like, I think you could trace those, you could pull those threads and see, it's not going to be exactly the same because Hopkins is a private organization, but Hopkins has very successfully managed to convince the city of Baltimore that their interests are congruent, right? That the Venn diagram of like good for Hopkins and good for Baltimore is a circle, right? And that is a narrative. That is an argument that Hopkins makes very well, very effectively to the city of Baltimore. And so to argue that, this neighborhood that was here is not really serving Baltimore in the same way that the Hopkins Hospital serve Baltimore. That's an argument. It's a narrative. But the things, the processes I talk about here, I think you can see play out in East Baltimore with some details changed. I think I would be interested in knowing. I'd be interested in sort of talking to people who do this kind of history for East Baltimore. I don't exactly understand why East and West Baltimore are so very sort of atomized in my brain, and I think certainly in mine, maybe in others. But it's a really good question. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to answer it super well, but I hope that you can use some of the things here to kind of help you, at least guide you to see how you might go about finding out what happened in those neighborhoods in Northeast Baltimore, for sure.
Yes, thank you.
For Fresh Princess, this is from chapter 6, page 100. Dr. Lieb writes, "The coming of violence to Baltimore's ghettos, the American Friends Service Committee's report." There's another one. I bet that's, white people, they commission all these reports.
That's the Quakers. They're the Quakers. Yep, that's the Quakers. Yep.
Okay. Report on Baltimore Civil Disorders, 1968 began, was no surprise, and the East Baltimore neighborhoods where the riot began were just the kinds of places people thought of when they thought of Baltimore's ghetto. They were among the oldest parts of the city and the poorest. They were also surrounded by another dismal sickle of urban renewal projects, the Latrobe Homes, the Jones Falls Expressway, the Somerset Court Homes, the Orleans Street Viaduct, the Douglas Homes, and the 59-acre John Hopkins Hospital campus under construction that neighbors called the Plantation, which together had dislodged thousands of black families from their homes. What housing remained was overcrowded, neglected by its landlords, and much too expensive. Police were abusive, Freddie Gray, shopkeepers were exploitative, and on and on. When one accumulates a list of the complaints of the people who lived in the neighborhoods like these, the committee's report concluded, one tends to wonder why the retaliation was not worse. They could have written this in 2015 and just said Freddie Gray,
yeah.
But there you go for John Hopkins.
Well, also for 2022, just an interesting note, during the COVID pandemic, Johns Hopkins reported that there was COVID in the plumbing lines of the Latrobe Homes. It's literally right across the street from the hospital. But they said it was just germane to Latrobe Homes, and I'm like, isn't it all on the same waterline?
Right. And isn't this like when we say it's a pandemic? Oh my gosh. Sorry, go on.
Right. Oh, no worries. They have been attempting for the past several years to get rid of those projects and have since begun to build up around it condos and things of that nature. So I'm sure in the next probably decade they'll be gone.
Yes. And you're 100% right that the language that they're using is not even echoes, but also just recapitulates the same language that we read about here, the language that, housing reformers used in the early part of the first decade of the 20th century when public health advocates were sort of arguing for the destruction of the quote-unquote slums of East and West Baltimore, where people were living in really crowded conditions. Bad, again, it is a fact that I don't want to underscore, like, if you are living in an extremely old house in Baltimore in 1910, you are living in a house that likely doesn't have indoor plumbing, right? Like, this is not good. The housing conditions in some places were not good. But the fact that, we're using the same language, it's not healthy, right? It's a contagion, right? It's like the diseases that it incubates are gonna affect us all and harm us all. So it's better for Baltimore if we pull it down. We're using that same language now. Exactly as you just pointed out, it really is. When you see it once, you can then see it every time that it comes up, right? That we're just using the same script. We might be a little classier around the edges when we use this language, but we are still using this language. So you're exactly right. That's a really good point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lieb, for your research. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Yes, let's see, retired firefighter in Florida. Did you have a question for Dr. Lieb? Oh, this book starts in Florida. I forgot. Jacksonville. That's North Florida, but still.
Jacksonville.
Forgot totally. Caller, retired firefighter in Florida.
Greetings, everyone. Greetings to the guests. My first question is I'm in South Florida, Miami Gardens to be exact. I grew up in South Florida also. I have been listening to you, especially in the beginning, and a lot of the things that you have been saying sounds very familiar with me, with the area in South Florida, Miami, that was called Overtown. Overtown was, do you know about the Overtown in South Florida, Miami?
A little bit, but tell everybody so that we all know. We're on the same page.
Okay. Basically, it was a allotment of land designed for the builders of the railroad that was controlled by a white male by the name of Henry Flagler, who was in friends with J.D. Rockefeller, to build a railroad to go all the way down to Key West, which is the southeasternest place in the northwestern hemisphere, especially the part that's called the United States. And basically, what destroyed the inhabitant of Overtown for black people was the main thing anyway was I-95 being built right in the middle, in the most industrious part of Overtown. You have been saying some similar things at other places. Do you think, this is my question, do you think this process is filed so any white supremacists that want to enact such a thing like a weapon on non-white people, especially non-white people who are classified as black, is it something that's on paper? or in a file somewhere?
Yes and no. So it's a great question. Thank you for asking it. And you should read, if you haven't, by the way, sidebar, if you haven't read Professor Connolly's book that we were talking about in the very beginning, A World More Concrete. It's about Miami. So it's about a lot of these processes in Miami. It's also just a beautiful book, so I highly recommend it. But yes, is it written down somewhere? The interesting thing about this mid-century urban renewal moment is that it almost didn't have to be, right? Because it was such the assumptions that policymakers made about who mattered and who didn't were, and whose property mattered and whose property didn't, except insofar as you could take it and get really rich, were kind of almost unspoken insofar as there is one quotation that's a policy, some guy who worked for the Federal Highway Administration, I think. There's a historian named Raymond Mole, who I think you may be writing, I think he might have been writing about Miami, but there is one very explicitly racist quotation that I won't repeat, but that a highway builder said. That quotation is quoted in like every single book about highway building, right, that there is, which says to me that most of the time people didn't say such explicitly disgusting racist things, right? They didn't, not because they didn't believe it, but because they didn't need to say it, right? Because those assumptions, again, about who mattered, about what cities were for, who cities were for, whose property we were, the sort of policymakers and rich people were trying to protect, were so pervasive among the sort of white power structures that you almost didn't need a playbook, right? Certainly, things that were really sort of blueprints and playbooks for this kind of work were, as I said, the Berman v. Parker Supreme Court case that sort of gave eminent domain, like supercharged the process of eminent domain. Certainly the Federal Highway Administration, there are, handbooks, right, that the Federal Highway Administration publishes. One of the things that changes you may know this, but listeners may know this, but in 1956, the Eisenhower Interstate Highway Program was established. So before the late 1950s, if cities wanted to build express highways or any kind of highways, they sort of needed to come up with the money, cities and states needed to come up with the money to pay for them. After this was a huge infrastructure spending bill. And what it did was it made building highways basically free. Cities had to pay 10%, or states had to pay 10% of the cost to build interstate highways. And the federal government picked up the rest. So it was like free money. And so everybody gets in on this, let's build expressways. Everybody climbs on that bandwagon. The practice is that, this sort of declaration of, identifying quote unquote blighted neighborhoods, that were mostly, neighborhoods where Black people lived or brown people in some cities, poor people sometimes, but not always. That was like, that certainly is in the handbook, right? So things like that, yes. So like, here's how you do this, right? Here's how you go out and like let's get a highway built, right? That does come from the federal government in some instances. State governments, likewise, state highway departments had, a sort of common set of practices that they adopted. So there are handbooks that tell you to go out there and essentially, because the problem is that if you're going to build a highway through a city that is already built, you have to build a highway through something, right? Like that is the problem with building. I mean, there are other problems with building interstate highways, but a major practical one is people live here, so somebody has to lose a house, right? And so how to get around that issue, how to decide basically who's going to lose their house, and definitely when it comes to here is how we are going to rob these people and not pay them, whatever, we can talk about what appraisals are and what a house value really is. But the fact is that like we're trying to, the government, state and federal governments are trying to pay people as little as they can for the houses that they take. And the way to do that is also certainly, that is policy. That is not like individual appraisers freelancing. That is the way that the state of Maryland or the state of Florida or the state of, Vermont or whatever, that is a set of practices that are codified. So it's not that there is a book somewhere in the National Archives of, just highway builders being, like bluntly racist. Again, not because they aren't, but because they don't need to be. The assumptions that undergird the blatant racism of their actions are sort of unspoken and kind of commonly agreed upon. It's not really until the late 1960s that people in power started listening to people not in power who lived in these communities who were saying, this is racist, this is white supremacy, this is a violation of our rights as Americans, this is a civil rights problem. CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, came to Baltimore and helped spearhead the movement against the East-West Expressway because they saw it, rightly, in my opinion, as a civil rights issue. So that kind of thing is pervasive and nationwide. And that is why we see, exactly as you say, we can see so many echoes and recapitulations of Baltimore's story in Miami, here in Seattle, right? In cities, in New Orleans, in cities nationwide, every city practically in the country. But there is not, most of the time in writing, people aren't saying blatantly racist things, but in my opinion, it doesn't really matter because their actions explain what they're doing and what they believe and who they value and who they don't. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. It's a good one, and thank you. And you should read Dr. Connolly's book. It's about Miami, and it's so good. You'll like it.
Was that your only question, retired firefighter?
I did have some thoughts, and I've been trying to fix a way that I can put it into a question, being that I was born and raised in an area called Richmond Heights, which is one of the early areas, I guess, in the United States that where black people started off with decent housing. The qualifications had to be a veteran, military veteran, and $100. That area now is being drastically changed from that background. I'm talking about veterans from World War I, World War II, my father, Korean War. Vietnam, they were still children at the time, and that sort of thing. So it really didn't get to that, but basically, it is drastically has changed to immigrants primarily from Cuba that I noticed on police identifications they identify them as white Hispanics. But the need for decent housing for black people is still relevant based on what the person who designed the area for. Do you have any commentary on that?
Do I have any commentary on that? I mean, yes, I think I have commentary on everything. Don't ask me that question. I can commentate all day. Yeah, I think that certainly one of the many tragedies here in this story that I tell and in the sort of story that you tell, the kind of what happened again in cities across the country, is that the way that we understand, I think, so when I started this whole conversation, I said, people watched The Wire and they kind of thought that they knew what Baltimore looks like, or, you quote Donald Trump, right? He thinks he knows what Baltimore looks like or what cities look like, and his issues are profound. But we, number one, do not understand as a nation that this is all built on robbery, right? That it's not simply a situation that, and even I think well-meaning white people, think that like, oh, well, like poor black people have bad housing because for some reason having to do with, poor white people or poor black people, having bad housing, and not seeing not only that we made this, but also this is not something that is a constant, right? That we had and took middle class homeowners neighborhoods from the black people who built them, who lived in them, who loved them, and we did that, and that undermines so many things, including the ability to build and to create and pass down generational wealth in housing that white people have had so much more easily available to them, right? The reason why I was able to go to Brown was that my grandfather, who worked for the railroad in Beaver, Pennsylvania, was able to get a VA loan to buy a house after World War II. Didn't have any money, but was able to get that loan. And that housing wealth enabled, my mom to go to college, which enabled, so the generational wealth that's stemming from housing is real. And it makes an enormous difference in people's experiences and people's possibilities that are available to both people in this country. And to just see it as something that isn't just like, oh, this just didn't happen for black people somehow. No, it did, and we took it. And that, I think, is a critically important thing to understand when we are, looking around and trying to figure out, again, why we live where we live, why our neighborhoods look like they do. The immigration aspect and the sort of, that is something I know much less about, but in the sort of, the way that neighborhoods filter from one community to the next, and what that in turn means for wealth building. And that I don't know as much about, but you are 100% correct that it is an incredibly interesting and critical to understand part of the story. It is not my area of expertise, but it is so important. And I think one of the things that one of the results of my work in Baltimore, particularly in West Baltimore, is that although Baltimore was in the late 19th century, a very heavily immigrant city, for a number of reasons. It had become by the 20th century, particularly by the mid 20th century, a much less of an immigrant city. And so I wrote this book, and I tend to think about to a degree that is not good, in just sort of a binary, right? Like there are white people and there are black people, but obviously that is not at all the case. And it is particularly not the case in cities. It is not the case in Baltimore, and it is also not the case in other cities, and Miami is a really good example of this. We can't just understand the stories of displacement and exploitation and expropriation along that kind of neat black-white binary. We have to also account for immigration, for communities of brown people, for the way, as you point out, for the very different ways in which we kind of define and classify different immigrant communities, and thinking about why it is that we do that, and why it is that we, for instance, as you say, regard Cuban American communities as sort of white Hispanics, whereas other communities we don't. So it's really important. You're very right. I don't have a great response to it, but it is true that in order to tell the story comprehensively in cities that are not, in places that are not West Baltimore, one does need to account sometimes, often, for the kind of complication of this isn't just a binary. It's not just about white people and black people. It's about lots of different kinds of people. And how does that complicate the story is a really good question.
Much obliged, retired firefighter in Florida. Just to his question about, do white people codify some aspects of how they practice racism so that it can be shared with other white people, and they go do the same thing, practice racism against non-white people. You did say early on in the text, this is on page 23, gone white to Negro. Despite their apparent limitations, each version of Baltimore's residential segregation ordinance had stamped a template for similar laws in other cities. So that I've just heard that sort of thing before. Edward Baptist, he talked about how plantation owners, they would share different torture techniques to better control the niggers on their plantation. So there is, I think, a long pattern of white people sharing templates on how to better run the plantation. Also, in your response, you were talking about your grandfather in Beaver, Pennsylvania. I did my same check. Is Beaver, Pennsylvania, sundown town? That's why Fresh Prince is in Philly. I know Pennsylvania, they do not let black people just move willy-nilly. Beaver, Pennsylvania, it says, while Beaver, Pennsylvania isn't as famously, now that's even here, isn't as famously documented as some other locales, historical patterns, census data, and local accounts suggest it fits the profile of a former sundown town exhibiting exclusionary practices against black residents and a near total absence of black people in its census records for decades, especially after World War II, typical of white-only towns in the region. Census records show a significant lack or absence of black residents in Beaver Borough and surrounding Beaver County for much of the 20th century, aligning with the sundown town demographics. Accounts from the residents and historians describe a pervasive atmosphere of racial exclusion, with black people being run out or discouraged from, that's violence again if you gotta being run out, especially after dark. I will cross that one off for no visiting Beaver, Pennsylvania.
It's okay. You're not missing much. And that's a really, I think, like, this is sort of, as we said earlier, I think this is a very good example of something like the limitations of, exactly as you say, what are we talking about when we're talking about sundown towns, right? Because, if there's a sign over the, welcome to Beaver or not, right? It is functionally a sundown town, right? If people can't get housing, if people can't get, I'm assuming this, I'm completely freelancing here, but I'm assuming a big part of that, of the exclusion that we're talking about in, like, this is a little town, for people who don't know, a little town near Pittsburgh. And there is the main, employers, when at least my grandparents were there, were like, there was a zinc smelter and the railroads. If, for example, and again, this is an if that I'm assuming is true, but I could be wildly wrong, I'm sure. If black people couldn't get jobs in the zinc smelter, or if they couldn't get good jobs, I'm sure that's true, where they could be hired, I'm sure that they were not getting, and this is something that we see, for instance, in Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore and in Bethlehem. But if people can't get jobs, they can't get well-paying jobs, if they can't be safe at work, if they can't feel, they can't not be abused at work by their white colleagues, if they can't get housing, if they can't comfortably go to school, then whether or not it's like a sundown town trademark, whatever, is less important than, like, it is one. It functions as one, it is one, right? Like, we can sort of say, I think, with confidence that, like, what we found here is a sundown town. If you can't swim in the pool, right? If you can't go to the playground, if you can't, like, all of these things that there may or may not be a sign over the entrance of the town, but if you can't live in a place, then it is a sundown town, which is the point you're making. I'm recapping it because it's so important to, when we think about how, again, why do we live where we live and why don't we live where we don't live? That is a huge, like, all of those different pieces, all of which are deliberate, all of which are, again, deliberately exclusionary. It's not just I am sure that my grandparents would have said that, oh, well, this isn't, like, we're not racist, right? We just happen to live in this place where there don't happen to be any black people. Well, then, friends, I have news for you about what it is that where it is that you live and what it is that you think and what it is that you value, right? So yeah, it's a really important point.
A part of the report said Black people being run out or discouraged from settling, that sort of evidence, I would have to even look at your grandparents and say the same thing that I said about those white people who said that they were baffled about all of these black people moving into the area. Like, now, wait a minute.
Absolutely.
You live in an area with no black people. And they have a record, apparently, of running black people out. And especially after World War II, we're supposed to be down with Hitler and no fascism and all that. And no black people. Get on out of Beaver Burrow. Come on.
Yeah. I mean, come on, right? And truly, like, and it's like, well, what do you, like, how do you justify your, and again, to go back to the point here that we made earlier too, like, this isn't just to, like, well, they probably, and my grandmother is a million years old, but she is still with us, so I don't want to, like, slander her on the radio, but I think that whether or not, however they would have described what it is that they thought that they were doing when they chose to live in Beaver and when they looked around and saw who their neighbors were and were not, right? The fact is that they were able to, as were white people in towns across the nation that operated in much the same way, they were able to profit from this. This was an exclusion that had, because of the sort of prevailing ideas about, and as I say in the book, this is all a lie, this is all a myth, this is something that Dr. Connolly talks about a lot, lots of people do, the sort of prevailing assumption that the presence of black people lowers property values. It's a huge lie, but everyone, lots of white people believed it, and so it, that sort of works to the advantage of white people who purchased and owned and sold property. Though that lie made a lot of people a lot of money, even people who didn't have really any money. Like, my grandparents didn't have any money, right? So even people who didn't have, it's not just bankers, it's not just the guy who runs the real estate firm, it's not just the guy who owns the department store that are making money off of this. It's every white person. And again, I say, like, and these are the things that made my life possible, right? And, like, that is something that we all have to reckon with and think about what that means, right? Like, where did the money that sent me to Brown come from, right? And it came from property in functionally a sundown town. That is something to think about.
It's crazy. I have to check more. When James Lowen, I said begrudgingly that book is in my top 10, now top 5 books in terms of revealing really what does it mean to be classified as white and how does racism, white supremacy work. As I said, Towson, that's why I looked immediately like, oh, okay, they don't know black people there. It's so, and when he said it's so common, he said, really, all of North America functions like a racially restricted region. You cannot just go wherever you want to. If you're a black person, even states that have a lot of black people, they generally are restricted to very specific locations in those states. In some states, it's really bad, that sort of thing. And he even talks about they have racial purges in some of these areas where, we're just done. You get out of here. This is from Pittsburgh Public Source, Beaver County deportation that forced 46 black people to leave the state. This is from 1933. Black laborers working in Beaver County were deported during the night to West Virginia. I can't even get onto. See, that's the sort of thing I'm going to have to go to read.
I'm not surprised. This is very interesting, and I am not remotely surprised, but I am I'm not thrilled to hear it, but it doesn't sound pretty right. And many of us have been to Western Pennsylvania. Well, it is. Yeah, I mean, this is something exactly as he says, as you say, like, this is not something that is restricted to a region of the country or a period of time, right? The way that this racism gets expressed is sometimes in, like, driving 46 black people out of Beaver County and into West Virginia, and it sometimes is more sort of on its face benign than that, but it is the same. It's the same pattern. It's the same. It's the same engine. It's the same. It's for to achieve the same end, and it's not just something that happens in the South, or it's not just something that happens, whatever in Tulsa or something. It's something that happens everywhere, that shapes everywhere. That, again, historians aren't supposed to say everywhere, but everywhere that we live. I mean, you are, I'm sure, very familiar with these stories about Seattle, right? And Seattle can't get enough of praising itself for being, just the most liberal place on the planet. And we have these same stories about, think about the things that happen in neighborhoods in North Seattle, within the memory of people who are still living there. So it's the same patterns, as you say.
Absolutely. I had a book question, but you used the term when you were answering retired firefighters' question, and you'd used it previously, well-meaning white people or well-meaning white person. What exactly? And for this one, if you could talk to us like we are, I don't know, like middle school dropouts. Think of us as like 10-year-olds, so maybe lower your vocabulary so we can easily grasp what you're saying. What is the difference between a well-meaning white person and the regular white people?
That is a very good question, and I think I will not speak to it in the contemporary context because it is that is not my area of expertise. Although I have opinions that you can probably imagine what they are. But I think that, so for example, you were asking about the Maryland Commission for Interracial Problems and Relations, or whatever it was, the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. One of the reasons why it was so hard for the people who were displaced in the Expressway corridor in Rosemont to find other new housing, and why that process was repeated again, the sort of speculation process was repeated again, then was because Maryland and Baltimore had no open housing laws until 1968 when there was a federal law that outlawed things like what's called racial steering, which is like realtors. But what you were talking about in the very beginning about Professor Connolly and his wife, those practices were ostensibly made illegal in 1968, but before that they were perfectly legal. And as you read in the book, Maryland and Baltimore did not have an open housing law. They tried to pass it 3 times, failed 3 times. Seattle similarly tried to pass an open housing law and failed. And so there were people, like many people associated with the Quakers, for example, the Friends Service Committee, and other white people who did the exact kind of activism that you were talking about with Dr. Connolly. Posing as home buyers, to sort of to just uncover and bring to light racist real estate practices, right? This is an interesting. So that's sort of the kind of person that I had in mind when I was talking about civil rights activists in one frame or another. But as we know, right, like being able to see some dimensions of a problem and being able to understand, perhaps in a more sophisticated way, how racism is functioning and where we can see it in our systems and how profitable it is, does not mean that, people aren't still, they're still living in the world they live in, right? They're still living in the systems they live in. They still live their lives the way that they live their lives. So I think that the kind of work of anti-racism does not preclude racism, if that kind of makes sense in other ways. But what I meant when I was talking about those folks was that kind of activist, particularly when it came to open housing and the real estate market, that that kind of work was a sort of there were white allies in that work with Black activists. Likewise, the expressway in Baltimore that I write about here, the East-West Expressway, was just one part of a big of a whole system that, again, I know not very much about some other parts of it, because if they're in East Baltimore, I don't know about them. But they're, so for example, I don't know if listeners are familiar with in Baltimore, Fells Point and Federal Hill, which are two very old, historic, now very gentrified neighborhoods, sort of right on the harbor. They kind of flank the inner harbor, basically. And those were historically white communities. They were, in the 60s, when they were threatened by the expressway, they were white communities. So it's not just Black people in Baltimore it was mostly Black people, but it was not just Black people who were at risk of losing their homes to the expressway. And so what happened was, in Baltimore, it was sort of a citywide movement against the expressway. There was an organization called Movement Against Destruction, which was a sort of consortium of something like 31 different groups from all over the city. The Rosemont Neighborhood Improvement Association was one. The Relocation Action Movement, which was sort of on the eastern end of the expressway corridor in Rosemont, and predominantly white organizations from other parts of the city that were threatened, as well as there were a lot of, as I talk about in the book, ultimately one of the lawsuits that delayed the construction of the expressway had to do with Rosemont was right next to it's a big park, kind of what's like a nature park, right? Not like a playground park, but like a park that's streams and trees and stuff. And the Sierra Club and predominantly white, not totally, but predominantly white environmentalists were the people who filed the lawsuit that ultimately. So ultimately, the reason why the road was successfully delayed long enough that it could be stopped was because the courts ultimately valued trees more than they valued Black communities. But those people, so the people in that kind of consortium of anti-road activists maybe are another example of people who imagine themselves to have and did have maybe a more sophisticated view of what racism is and how it manifests and how it works and how it costs. But again, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exempt you from, you're still a white person living in the world. You still have enormous privilege, and being a person who kind of can understand that on some level does not make you like a hero, if that kind of answers your question.
You're just saying just buckets and buckets of
that for sure. That, in fact, that sounded very similar to the verbiage that is used with the term blight. And specifically because you said in your response, Dr. Lieb, you said allies, white allies, which is a term I caution against using. Being called a white ally is almost being called a hero. And importantly, when she talked about this consortium of folks who rallied to get this highway stopped, that did not ultimately help out the Black people who lost their houses, at all. But, whatever.
Not at all. Right. Yeah, no, you're right.
Consortium. Hang on 1 second, though. But this consortium, importantly, she said that she was talking about this different hodgepodge of groups. She said the white people who lived in other parts of the city, important because Baltimore, she already told us, has been super successfully so-called segregated, where at least white people almost exclusively live around other white people, Black people almost exclusively live around other Black people. So that's why the white people, we're not neighbors, but we might be a part of this group to stop the highway. And some of these people in the consortium are the tree hugger people. Like, they not necessarily are with the Negroes. So that's what I mean. Like, I don't even use the term well-meaning white people, because so-called well-meaning, even that, white people do not say white people practice racism. They say white people benefit, they get white privilege, and blah, blah, blah. White people practice those racially restricted regions, so-called sundown towns. that is practicing racism. That is not ignorance. That is a very willful and whether we put the sign up or not, no niggers. That is a very willful, intentional. The violence is right there. Let that sun drop and see what I mean. That is all practicing racism. That's not ignorance. And maybe you have one or two. One, even the well-meaning white people are pretty lame. That has to be that. I mean, that's obvious. Duh. Not saying anything spectacular. They are the lamest of the lame white people. It's got to be, if they're even sincere about. Maybe they're just the tree huggers. They're not even here to. We're confused. They're not even about helping the black people. They're just here because they want to make sure the snails don't get squashed or.
They did love those snails. They love the snails.
See. Yeah. Come on. So that's what, in my view, well-meaning white people, these are very dangerous. It gets back to what I said. We are very reluctant to saying, hey, white people are not blind. They're not ignorant. In fact, we don't even have no John Browns on our team. White people are dedicated to practicing racism. Even what retired firefighter asked, they trade tips on how to better practice racism. There's some evidence of that in your book and others. Like, that is the accurate way to think about what does it mean to be classified as white. Why does this problem persist? Why is it everywhere? Like, that is a much more accurate than white allies and well-meaning white people and blind white people and ignorant. That is lies. We've said that is all lies. All lies.
Yeah, and to your point about, we were talking about the sign over the school, right? The notion that that somehow you don't know why you're, for example, to use Beaver as an example, right? To pretend like you don't know why you don't have black neighbors, and to pretend like you don't know why your school doesn't have black kids in it. Yes, you do know why. Right, that your point is very correct. Like, this is not a mystery. It is sort of couched enough so that whether they're well-meaning or not, white people don't have to look at it, don't have to name it, and so they can tell themselves that this is, who can say, like, again, the Seattle school superintendent in the 50s who was just like, well, we have segregated neighborhoods, question mark why, but here we are and we can't do anything about it and it's not our job to fix it. It's nothing we did, right? But it is something that you did and it's something that you are doing. And it's choices that you made and, as you say, are continuing to make. So to pretend to make believe like we don't know how we have gotten the landscapes and communities that we have is exactly, it's a lie.
Most powerful weapon, system of white supremacy. Lots of deliberate lying. I guess if I get one more before we let you enjoy the rest of your Tuesday or Wednesday evening, I thought it was so important. You talk about class distinctions. I've even read a few of them, middle class and all of that, and it pops up in the book in a number of, I thought, important ways. And I can see if I can tie two of these together. Let's see. So one of the first times that I noted it, let's see. This is earlier on in the text. This is page 39. Kind of the.
Oh yeah. Okay.
I guess great picture there, so you can see some of
I love that picture.
Loretta Avenue, Baltimore. So during the early 1950s, the people who we've been talking about so far, the Corbetts, the Willises, the Barcliffs, and the Penns, did not really consider the people who lived on the Edmondson Terraces blocks along Loretta, picture included, and Aruna and Harlem Avenues to be part of their neighborhood. They were not, for example, eligible to be part of the Improvement Association. The Edmonton Terraces houses were a little older, a little less expensive, closer to busy commercial streets, and further from the park. There were more renters down there and more people with blue-collar jobs. As the Rosemonters themselves might have put it, The Rosemont Homeowners Improvement Association's block was middle class, and Edmondson Terraces was not quite. The city's plan for the expressway would soon blur these distinctions, though, and because the Edmondson Terraces houses were eventually condemned for the expressway and the RHIA's block was not, we have a little more information on their sales history. Now, this is one portion. Now, the other one, this I'm skipping down. This is substantially later in the book, about midsection. So this is on page 94. Bottom of 94. Okay. This is, if you are dead, you are dead. The people in the RNIA represented still had the same vision of who they were, what they had, what they were owed, and why they were owed it. Because, as they said, they were citizens, taxpayers, homeowners, and in their defense of their neighborhood's general complexion, and in an example of what historian N.D.B. Connolly calls the contradictions of self-interest and black solidarity, the RNIA's members said the same kinds of things about the people who live in Baltimore's public housing that white people like Helen and Herbert Bowers might once have said about them. The majority are of questionable character, Gwendolyn Mickle said at one meeting, and are idle, living on welfare, therefore free to roam the area, which can lead to crime and trespassing on private property. Public housing is mainly populated by people who have many more children than they can care for or supervise properly, added attorney Archie Williams. This is an influx on the community. We're not against housing, Mary Rosemont told a reporter later, but the people the new buildings would bring into the neighborhood can't take care of themselves. That, she added, is why they're here. Part of this response was simple snobbery. Regardless of one's color, Connolly writes, the suburban ideal included a discernible distance from poor black people, trash, and property Negroes had long held as one of Jim Crow's greatest evils, the elision of class distinctions that made it possible to tell and keep riffraff apart from their betters. I thought both of these were brilliant just because I've said for eons, if you study white people and the system of racism, I might be stupid, I might be missing the nuance, but man, you would be left with the distinct impression, Negroes is Negroes. Wait a minute, I got $1 billion and, I got a mansion, I got a fancy... Negroes is Negroes. You even got some of these people, they were born in Barbados, because I know we got some folks there and you got to have a U.S. passport. I told you, Negroes is Negroes. I don't care if you're a Barbados Negra, Mississippi Negra, rich Negra, poor Negra, Negroes is Negroes. And we get very confused because it seemed like it bothered some of these black people, like, hey, we're not like those poor black people over there. We own our houses. Yeah. Negroes is Negroes to racists.
Yes, exactly. And I think there's a couple of really important things in this sort of thread of the story. And the biggest one is exactly that, right? This to the city, to the powerful white people who are making these choices and sort of creating doing the stealing doing all this stealing, right? Committing all this violence. There is no distinction between the people who live in Rosemont, the people who live like so as I say, the block at the sort of end near the park where the folks that you just read about lived, the people who lived, the sort of people who lived in a slightly like less fancy part of the highway corridor to the east. The people who live in, there's one more segment of the expressway to the east of that, which is in an older, poorer part of West Baltimore. The city makes no distinctions about that. No distinctions about, and I'm not like making the argument that whether or not you own your house is material to whether or not you should lose it or how much money you have is not. But the city was not making any, exactly as you say, they're making no distinctions. And more than that, then, what happens after, and this is very complicated, so I'll do it very quickly. What happens after the city pauses the expressway plans and embarks upon this incredibly misbegotten quest to rehabilitate, or not rehabilitate as it happened, the houses that had been condemned and stolen from their owners and resell them in a program that the federal program called that referred to kind of as homeownership for the poor, right? The officials, white officials, are so much not making this distinction that they really think that they have, like, what's the problem here, right? We had black people living here. We're going to have more black people living here. It's all the same. And so they are really, so, you read in the book about there was like all these meetings that they had where they like invited the wrong people because they didn't see a difference, right? Whereas as you know, the people who, the people who had, the sort of fancier people who lived who were part of the original Rosemont Neighborhood Improvement Association, as you say, were very interested in maintaining class distinctions, and we're very interested. So in the beginning, before we even get the highway plan, as you read, the city tried to build a couple of other things in the neighborhood that sort of more nuisances. One was a box, like a cardboard and a packing crate factory, and then they were also going to build a school that was going to require them, they said, to tear down the houses on that block to put a school there instead. And the way that the people who lived, the members of the RNIA, framed their opposition to these to those moves, and as you read just now, to like the construction of a public housing project there, was like, hey, no, we're like, you're not understanding. Like you perhaps have misunderstood. Like, we are like you. We are people with money, and we are lawyers. We are teachers. We are people with college degrees. We have money. We have houses. They say, apropos of the school construction fight in 1957, they say, like, I think the quote is like, couldn't some site involving less expensive houses be chosen instead, right? So they're not necessarily arguing for, like, let's not do this at all, or let's, they're simply saying, like, listen, we are like, they see themselves as the peers of, and they're not dumb. They are certainly aware of the racism dynamic at play. But they're arguing from a position of, we are property owners, as they say, citizens, taxpayers, homeowners, right? That's what gives us standing to make this claim for ourselves and our neighborhood and our homes. And we are not quite like the other people in this same kind of dilemma, right? They're not seeing it as, they are very aware of these class distinctions, and they're very important. They matter. The city, as you say, right? The city sees no such class distinctions. It sees black people. It sees blight, right? It just sees like sees this like blur that doesn't a blur that doesn't matter really, and so there is no distinction. And so one of the reasons why, again, this third part with the homeownership for the poor thing is very confusing and complicated. But I often am asked, like, what could they have done better, or differently, and I don't have a good answer for that. But one of the things that is really stark, and you can see when you're reading about the conversations that officials are having with one another and the conversations that they're having with the people who lived in the neighborhood, is that they don't see any distinction. That class distinctions are invisible. They only see black people, and they act accordingly. Again, I'm not making the argument that like people who own their houses and went to dental school are more entitled to keep those houses than somebody who didn't do those things. But the city certainly is not making any distinction. And so what that does is it sort of creates almost a community where there wasn't one before, because the city, in saying like, oh, you're all the same and you're all, your houses are all being condemned, you're all sort of caught in the same like trap, right? That creates, it sort of knits a community together that might not have otherwise been knit together because the sort of class distinctions that existed sort of kept it apart, if that kind of makes sense.
I see the logic there. Words are very important. That's come across through the dialogue. I do not use the term community for black people. White people have a community, but if people who don't even live where you live, they don't even live in the city where you live, much less zip code, they don't even live in the same city that you live, who are hostile to you, can sit around and make decisions about whether or not you will continue to live in your house, whether you will have water, whether your water will be poisoned, whether you have to move, whether you have schools. People who are hostile to you sit around and make decisions about every aspect of your life that is important. You do not have a community. If you have a community, hey, you're supposed to have, you don't put no highway here. We got houses and, all that, and get on out of, you gave the story of the white people. These weren't even super wealthy white people. They got the highway stopped. That power, that's, you have a community. Black people don't have anything like that.
Yeah, and you're very right that for sure, that is not that's not what the powerful white people are seeing. They're not seeing community at all. So it's not even like they're seeing a community and not distinguishing between its components. They're not seeing a community at all. They're seeing something that, as you have pointed out, right, just doesn't matter at all. They're just seeing dollar signs. They're seeing a piggy bank. They're not seeing people. So for them, it's got nothing to do with community.
Just for distinction's sake, I guess people have that same way with blight. People have different definitions for community. This is irrespective of what white people see. I'm saying if you are a victim of racism and you live your group, you all don't even have the ability to, hey, we're going to make sure this highway does not live here. We have power, that P word, the important one. We have power to make sure that no highway is going to come through here. They're not going to make up some lame excuse to come and just move us willy-nilly and give us 5 cents and tell us to make do. Hey, if you don't qualify for a community unless you have that sort of power to defend and protect yourself. That's what I'm saying about really all victims of white supremacy. Like, just looking at what do we mean when we say community? Like, it can't just be people can come and smack you around anytime and we got to come, like, what, or man, you got a really lame, weak community if that is the case. And I mean, what is community for? Come on. Let's be, words are important.
That makes a lot of sense.
Words are important.
No, I think you're right about that. That makes a lot of sense to me.
We have been chatting it up. The book just came out, nonfiction, has a lot of great detail. Hopefully I've read some snippets so you all will be motivated to go nab Road to Nowhere, how a highway map wrecked Baltimore, and racism, white, and ode to NDB Connolly again, Shawnee Mott, his wife, condolences. She passed away at such a young age, mother of 3, passed away at such a young age. I think, man, you lose, I think it's approximately $300,000, just like many of the victims in the book that we talked about. You lose $300,000 on the appraisal of your house. That cannot be good for your health in any universe. Like, I cannot figure it. I am feeling great. Like, woo, my children's hospital or college payment and tuition is taken care of, and woo, grandchildren got that set aside. I mean, I cannot imagine a universe where that doesn't, that's another one where, wow, You don't even have a correct means of assessing the value of you have to go to people who are hostile to you to assess the value of your house. You don't have a community, respective of how much your house is worth. You can't even assess what your house is worth accurate. Like, man.
Yeah.
Anyway, I enjoyed and learned tons from the book. I think I said accurately, it's equal parts informative and sad. Yeah. But important to learn. I learned a lot about Baltimore, so yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for everybody for your questions and listening for such a long time. This was so interesting and such a fun conversation. I really, really appreciate it.
Learned a lot, man. Thank you so much. Again, our guest, Dr. Emily Lieb, right here in Seattle, Washington, with Gus T. Thank you so much, and have a safe Wednesday evening.
Thank you. You too, and happy holidays, everyone.
For sure, for sure. Dr. Emily Lieb, the author of Road to Nowhere, How a Highway Map Wrecked Baltimore. Man, learned a lot. And this is like makeup for folks. I missed, she was at Elliott Bay Bookstore a couple weeks back, and I missed out. So now I feel like I didn't miss out. Learned a lot. For sure.
This was better than that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great evening, Dr. Lee.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night. Context of White Supremacy. 2 days in a row. We were here yesterday. We had, I'm going to mess his name up, Professor Camilo Eugenio Lund Montano. There we go. I think I might have even gotten it correctly, but he was with us yesterday, live from Puerto Rico, no less. First time we've had someone live from Puerto Rico, and we still didn't get away from whites. In fact, I got to say it. I just told you 2 days in a row, I got to say black people are treated like trash. In fact, I think she said it today. I said it yesterday. So it got said 2 days in a row. We'll see what happens during neutralizing workplace racism tomorrow. We'll see if folks have any thoughts from what they heard from Dr. Lieb. I'll share right quick. Beaver County. See, that's why I say sundown towns, reading more important than watching television. Definitely a book you should read. In the Catherine Massey Book Club. I'm so glad we've read that book. My goodness. Oh, that right. Nonfiction book we read today. Nonfiction. But when I hear a city, town, what have you, county, frequently, if I have like a free moment, unless I'm, really pressed for time, I try to take 30 seconds. Look, is this a sundown town? James Lowen, he put that website up, updated the registry. We talked to that white woman in Germany. She said she helped put that data on the website. And you would be amazed. I told you they just had the case, the black female. She went into labor. She went to the hospital in Crown Point, Indiana. She went into labor and the hospital denied her service. Now, I know this happened a few times recently, but this was specifically in Crown Point, Indiana. And I looked and I said, is this a sundown town? Yep. And I said, oh man, I would want to be informed about that. We don't want to do no stopping in Whitestown, Indiana. Racially restricted region. Keep going. Beaver County, Pennsylvania. That's where they deported the 46 niggers. And I even looked at this report because I've never been to Beaver County. I have been to Pittsburgh, but I've never been to Beaver County. So I'll read a little bit. It says, on a cold winter night, it's December, right? Cold winter night, 1933, a group of rogue Beaver County police. Now, even that, because that makes it seem like this was not typical white behavior. Like these were some riffraff. They just were out doing their own thing. They weren't with the normal unit. Raided a home in Industry an Ohio River community about 6 miles west of Beaver. Inside the home, the white cops found about 60 black men and women dancing and drinking. What happened afterward became a civil rights flashpoint. 46 of the revelers were piled into trucks, driven to the state line, and told not to return to Pennsylvania. The case had been forgotten until recently, yet it happened at a time when mass expulsions of black people were being carried out in communities across the country, including in southwestern Pennsylvania. Because of the people involved and the circumstances behind why hundreds of black laborers were working in Beaver County that year, the episode resonates with current events. Outside the biographies of some of the civil rights leaders involved in the case, including Pittsburgh Courier publisher Robert Vann, the local NAACP chapter president Homer Brown, and national NAACP president Walter White, the incident had disappeared from local memories and history books. Beaver County history enthusiast Roger Applegate was the first person to write about the deportation in nearly a century. He learned about it while surfing through newspaper databases looking for story ideas for a local historical society newsletter. It goes on to give more details about the black workers. They lived on a shanty and helped construct this dam. Even that, I guess they didn't want the Negro laborers actually living in Beaver proper while they helped with the dam. Like, we don't want to get out there in a tent or something and do that. It's cold in Pennsylvania. Can you imagine? Like, they don't have all the amenities and stuff. They don't have like electrical warmed vests, and you got all your fancy camping gear, and you got your North Face vest and all the rest of it. Like, man, you out, say you're gonna have to go in the shanty town. That's like a tent. 1930, you have a tent. Where's the latrine at? Well, you got a hole next to your tent. Like, man, and you go work all these, like, come on. And then they kick you out, dump you in West Virginia because you were playing music too loud. They call that reckless jocularity. Anyway, we'll take a quick break and then see if folks have any thoughts to share what they heard from Dr. Lieb on a Wednesday evening. Now I wish I had heard, what did they talk about at Elliott Book Bay? Like, did their dialogue sound like ours? Because they normally talk for like an hour, maybe an hour, 10 minutes or so, and they take questions, so you all could have, put a hand up and all that. I wonder what they talked about at Elliott Bay Books. I'll think about that. We'll take a quick break. Context of White Supremacy. We will be right back.
And from the late 1960s, after the death of Martin Luther King and the riots and the upheavals and all like this, and black people with their fists in the air and all like that, and trying to stumble and fumble and find their way and get focus, the white supremacists made a blueprint and put it into action. And that is, I'm going to have these people so confused, they don't even know what they started out to do. And by the late 1970s, they had just about completed it. And we've been on that ever since. And you mentioned something very important. They are more comfortable than ever. But see, it's like making gorillas comfortable in a cage, or monkeys, or pandas. You still got them in a cage, but they're comfortable. See, so give him some bling bling. It's like giving an animal a brand new car and training the animal to ride up and down the street in it. And then you stand back and point at the animal. Like one white man said in the late 1950s. He said he doesn't care what kind of car a Negro has. He said he's still a nigger. And when he rides by in a shiny car, to him, it's just a monkey in a car. White people built a car, put a monkey in it, trained the monkey to drive the car, so now you're looking at a monkey in a car. See, but black people don't see themselves that way. But this is how the white supremacists see us, and they are the ones who run our business. And we have to know that when they look at us, that's what they see. That's what they see. That's what they see. And at a subliminal level, what they see begins to spill over into our brains so that we, at a subliminal level, see each other that way. And indirectly see ourselves that way.
That's why the class distinctions were important to the black people. Say, I'm not like them black people. Get them black people on down there. Got a nice house, and I got me a nice car. I got me old Tesla out there. You get old Leroy down there. Negras is negras. White people are not ignorant about racism. You can just stack on. I love when we can have one. That's why it's white guests only. But I love when we can have white guests on the program and just stack and stack and stack. Keep saying it. White people are not ignorant about racism, and just keep getting them to co-sign that, because that is a pernicious, dangerous lie. It's right up there with not all white people are racist, because we got them well-meaning white allies. But that is because so many non-white people think that way, so many victims, that they have to inform white people about racism. Are you out of your cotton-picking mind? Oh, yes, we are. Well, we have been confused and lied to by white people. They are not ignorant at all. Who do you think invited Dr. Emily Lieb to Elliott Bay Books to discuss her brand new book? Do you think it was overrun with Gus T's Negro neighbors in Seattle? What about them, the black Tacomans? Do you think they came north? They could learn about racism in Baltimore? I've been to Elliott Bay Books bunches of times to see bunches of authors talk about racism. I have never been there when it was a lot of black people to hear somebody talk about racism. Never. Never. Ignorant. But who do you think even would buy such a book? Anyway, important point. She said it was a fun conversation. I don't necessarily find talking about white supremacy, racism, but her book is sad. Talking about black people losing their houses. Black people having all of this money stolen from them in the process of trying to maintain a house. I thought that was really, really sad. And to just keep hearing the same old story over and over and over. Like, man, it's pitiful. Super pitiful. I also thought it was important. I kept thinking, like, what did the conversation at Elliott Bay Books sound like? Because they have a facilitator who'd have been like Gus, right? He just basically the same format. It just would have been less time, and it would have been in person. But they'll question, boom, boom, go back, read snippets from the book, and then go to the audience. Maybe ask some more questions in between, like, did they push back when she said white people in the blinders and going down the white people are ignorant? Did they push back even with portions from her book? Like, nah, man, white people are really informed. You talk about that over and over in the book. These white people commission studies and reports and all of that. Like, and they codified the school. Like, oh my God, they literally, she breaks it down like the schools are numerically coded. It'll be, it's something like schools that are numbered 0 through 99, these are for the white students, elementary students, and then the schools 100 through 400, these are Negro schools, and then the schools that are 400 through 700, these are for the white high school. Like, it's super codified. That's another one. Like, man, you are not ignorant about racism. In fact, I think she even talked about it was so, man, some of these folks, like, they lived right on the cusp, the cutoff of the white neighborhood, like official, branded, proper. And she has in the book, white people, they would brag about being a white only neighborhood. You can't be ignorant about racism if you brag about being white only, and that still happens today. They just don't do it as explicitly about the white part. Anyway, but while they're bragging about being white only in good old Baltimore, they explicitly will take advantage of the fact that these black people, I think she said like 1/5 of the population of Baltimore was being squeezed into 1/50th of the housing. Got that right? Got it? 1/5 of the population of Baltimore, the Negroes, was being squeezed into 1/50th of the housing that was available. They're like super squishing black people and squishing them into all this housing. So you got all this overcrowding and all of it. And then they can say it's blight too. And then super overcharging them on all of that. This is not ignorance at all. Exploitation at every level. Oh, but the slick thing that they would do, so if I live right on the threshold of the white official white neighborhood, what they would do is, let's say if I'm right on the threshold, and so the front door for my property, if it's on the threshold where the street that the front door is actually on is not official a part of the white neighborhood, they would put a new door, front entrance, like new so-called front entrance, on the other side of the house that was on the other street that was on the official white neighborhood mapping. So that way they could even switch the address to the house. As she said, if you put the entrance on the other side, you could switch your house address, and hey, I'm in the white neighborhood and all that, even though you didn't move nothing. You just moved, or just really, you could just add a door. Technically, you would even have to get rid of the other one. You just add a door, I guess, move the mailbox, and boop, white neighborhood. Not ignorant about racism at all. Not even close. White people lying to black people too. I thought that was really important. Also, I thought it was when Fresh Princess, when she asked about John Hopkins. I'm not a scholar on Baltimore. It's been a long time since I've been to Baltimore. I don't want to go back to Baltimore. My president told me it's a hellhole. So, like, I'm good. I haven't even seen The Wire, and I don't want to. Reading more important than watching television. But I'm good. But, man, I was thinking, Princess said, Fresh Princess, she said, what about the John Hopkins? I'm thinking she gonna slam dunk this one because she got that passage where they referred to John Hopkins as the plantation, where they got this big chunk of acreage and booted all the black people out. I think she said like thousands of them, and she didn't even mention that at all. Like, dang, you got a big, nice chunky paragraph. Now I know you can't remember every page in the book, and she has lots of footnotes and citations and all that. So I mean, granted, but I mean, dang. I just read the book. Like, I didn't go do no major, like, I'm going to take, a month and highlight and go look up and research everything. And I'm familiar with redlining, yes, but not Baltimore. Like, not at all. I've never heard of no Rosemont or none of these people, really. Man, that kind of, I've had that happen a few times before where we, talked about something or a question was asked about something that they talked about in the book, and I'm thinking that this is a layup, like, oh, you talked about this directly, and they act like they had never heard of it. Now, it could be, like I said, she just forgot, whatever, but Man, at minimum, can we give Gus T some for that one? At least Gus T, because I thought that was important. Like the local black people called John Hopkins the plantation for taking all their property. We can give Gus T a little bit for not being no lazy host, and he did do his research and read a little bit, get prepared for these white guests. Here. Okay. Also, maybe he can get two here's. One, yes, we started with the Archdiocese of Baltimore raping children. Why did you do that, Gus? I'm going to stand on my square every day. We've been here for 17 years. This is what we do. Now, really, I was going to start and say immediately, white people don't care about children. Now, if she'd had something where I could have really sunk in on in the book, I would have. Now, I mean, it's kind of there because they don't care about black children, but I really wanted something like all children, all of them. But I mean, she mentioned the Archdiocese and them getting involved to kind of help out black people get housing. Obviously, they failed. But when I read that, I said, man, these old lame, child-raping, lying white people, these are the well-meaning white people? Get on out of here. Jeff Epstein, get on. If that's the well-meaning white people, I'm cool. We just have to work it out amongst ourselves. Like, get on out of here. Yes, I quit. And because that's so current. Like, that's right, like, neck and neck. National Guard needs to go to Baltimore. It's a hellhole, and the rats taking over. And Westmore, they got a Negro governor in Maryland. What are we going to do with Baltimore? All of that is concurrent with Archdiocese in Baltimore is bankrupt. Why? All the decades of white Catholic priests raping children. What does it mean to be white? Where is Coach Travis Turner? That's in Virginia. Like I said, now, if you want to talk about Jeffrey Epstein, no problem, but don't act like that's an anomaly. White culture. The Olympic doctor, the Boy Scouts being bankrupt too. What? Raping children. Jared from Subway. Mary Kay. We want to talk about Seattle. Mary Kay. White culture. But that was why the Archdiocese was there. There was mentioned in the well-meaning white people. And I'm glad that would be another one. Gus T. Man, I don't know if they would have asked her at Elliott Bay Books in Seattle, what do you mean when you say well-meaning white people? I still don't think at this late date you have very many podcasts, programs where a black host would ask a white person, what do you mean when you say that? What is a well-meaning white person? How could such a thing even to question them about that? And white people being ignorant about racism. Not going to talk. I do not just talk one way about racism when there's no white people here and then switch up. Nope. I'm going to be logical about racism, white supremacy, regardless of who is here. And in fact, I look forward for the opportunity for white people to be here. See if you can make them say, yep, co-sign on it and give evidence as to, am I being logical and accurate? Anywho, the folks who dialed in, did you all have commentary before we wrap it up? Let's see, I don't know, Fresh Princess, retired firefighter. Did they have quick commentary or anything of relevance? Did you learn anything, Dr. Lieb?
Greetings, everyone. Again, I learned some things. One thing was interesting that I was hearing was the place called Beaver County or Beaver, Pennsylvania. And, you know, what struck my mind, because I know a lot about quote unquote tackle football, was Joe Namath. He's from that area. And he used to brag about his relations with black people in that area, but he never did come up with the term sundown town as far as when he wasn't playing with these black players in basketball and football. He never did talk about the racism aspect that existed in this place, which was apparently very popular. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
They got a I'm looking at this report in the Pittsburgh Public Source. I'll post it online about this purge of Negro workers from Beaver County in 1933. That's why I said so many of these prominent people, I think like Joe Biden, and it's a very impressive. James Lowen talks about in the book too, people classified as white. When you see like, where did you grow up? Oh, wow. And you go look like, yep, that's Sundown Town too. But they have a picture, and it's got a black person, stereotypical like racist depiction of a black person, but whatever. And it says, notice, Negroes who have lived in this town less than 7 years must move by order of the mayor of Pennsylvania town. And this is talking about Beaver County after they made all the Negro residents beat it right outside the shanty town of Beaverton. I'm going to have to see if they got... Oh, there's a book about this. I can't believe it. So the book is Banished from Johnstown, Racist Backlash in Pennsylvania. That is... I shouldn't laugh because that's not funny, but man. And I have to say important because Elliott Jaspin, he said there's about 260 of these types of incidents where they go and boot out all the black people and take all their property or kill a bunch of black people or, whatever. They send you off to West Virginia or some foolishness like, who wants to go to West Virginia? Like, I'm not even saying Pittsburgh is the coolest place in the world, but West Virginia? That's where like when they say, poor white people, oh my God, yeah, not all white people is racist. They got the one-tooth white people in West Virginia. Woo! Did you have a commentary, Fresh Princess? Might have ditched us. That's fine too. Like I said, she got that question in about the John Hopkins, Freddie Gray. Henrietta Lacks. She got a question about John Hopkins. I was surprised she didn't remember the plantation. Anywho, we'll be here tomorrow neutralizing workplace racism, and Friday, tonight we bombed the U.S. Capitol, Session 4. And then compensatory call in this weekend where we will talk about the Brown bombing. She was a little loquacious. If she had been more succinct, I would have probably asked her, have you been paying attention to the Brown bombing? Like, I don't know at what point she was there, but I was going to ask her about the security setup. Like, are you surprised that they have not nabbed a suspect? Like, I mean, man, did they have did they have their own security on campus and cameras and all the rest of it? Like, how in the world? But yeah, she was a little more loquacious. Hopefully some constructive information for folks listening in. Anyway, we'll be here tomorrow neutralizing workplace racism. I am super glad that the historic flooding and rain and all that in Washington State didn't disrupt either of our participation, because a lot of people here lost power and they've had levee failures and mudslides. It has been wild like for the past 7 days. I guess they're having snowstorms and such in other places, so I'm glad it's not snowing. I'm glad it's not cold. It was only like 56 degrees today, so hey. But man, it has been almost cataclysmic with the raining and flooding and mudslides and road closures. Like, it has been wild the past 7 days. And yeah, I'm thankful we didn't lose power. Thankful our guest didn't lose power so she could dial in and participate too. And hopefully worthy of folks Wednesday evening. sobriety would be better. Hey, you do not want to be accused of what reckless jocularity. Have armed whites round you up and ship you off to West Virginia. Or even President Trump, he said, hey, we're going to send in the National Guard. You got them hardcore drug addicts in Baltimore. Shh. We're going to deal with you. Creator, we ask that you remind us, in spite of the alleged well-meaning white people, stop saying not all white people are racist. Stop name-calling people classified as black, even the poor black people who don't own a house. Even the poor black people who do not own a house. Stop name-calling people classified as black. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Cow signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.